The Vatican police, they're the most highly trained fighting force in the world.
Better than Magnum Force?
The Vatican has their own police force, better than Magnum Force, yeah. Better equipment, better training. The Vatican police, trust me, look it up.
Good evening, TradTards fans. Another great episode of the Puffs with Peter podcast, as I like to call it. Today, it's actually incredible for me to say this. We have a guest that has his own Wikipedia page, which means that he is notable. And it's a good Wikipedia page, which is also a very good thing. And, it might seem redundant to introduce him for some of, our listeners here, because he's already so well known within our space. But just in case you don't know who he is, I'd like to briefly introduce him. This gentleman is an author, a historian, a lecturer, a knighted individual as well, and frankly, one of the heavyweights in our sphere. And I am so pleased and happy and thankful that he agreed to come on. And I want all of you to play nice in the comments, because I want to make a good impression, because he's an amazing individual, in my opinion. Mr. Charles A. Coulombe, all the way from Europe, calling in tonight, so it's very late. Sir, thank you so much for coming on. And as I mentioned before, I understand you share the love of the boater cap. So, and they say that imitation is the highest form of flattery. So I hope with my seersucker and with the boater cap that I have flattered you enough to begin the episode. Thank you again for coming on.
Well, I'm sufficiently flattered, and of course, I'm always happy to see both seersucker suits and boater hats, which are a uniquely American contribution. I can say these words: a uniquely American contribution to world culture. I'm very, very proud of some of the things the Americans have done. Those are two of them: jazz, cocktails. The Great American Songbook. There's a lot we've done. Snake oil. We invented it.
Yep.
A lot of people don't take pride in snake oil, but I do.
Well, something had to lay the groundwork for everything that came out of COVID, right?
Well, exactly. COVID. I'll tell you, I spent COVID over here, and the ITI, the International Theological Institute, where I was attending school at the time and close to which I live now, it was locked down. But we're the only university-level school in Austria that continued to function all through COVID. And it wasn't easy, believe me, but we did. For 3 months, we were trapped here in this little town south of Vienna. But finally, in May of 2020, the dread disease had done whatever it did to the degree that we were able to go up and visit Vienna again. First thing I see, early in the morning, a man's walking down the street on the Kärntnerstrasse, and he has one of those stupid masks, but he's burned a hole through it with his cigarette. And he's smoking through the mask, puffing away. And I looked at that and I thought, Vienna will not be conquered, not by COVID, not by anyone.
Also, too, tobacco, another great thing from the American continent that became huge in Europe.
That is for sure. And I'm out of cigars just at the moment, sadly. But I have my trusty pipe.
I can email you one of these.
Oh, very good.
Yeah,
Oh, sorry
but
about that.
oh, you're all good. Yeah, I know that there's obviously so many things to talk about, especially, I mean, this has been a weird year already. It's crazy to think we're only just now getting to April. What 2026 will hold, only the Lord knows, in my opinion at this point. But one thing my viewers know, they don't know a lot about me, but they do know I am a proud Virginian. Not by birth. I wasn't born in Virginia, but I've lived here my whole life. And one thing about Virginia and the Greater South has always been the history of the Civil War. You can't escape it. There's always a battlefield or something somewhere if you live in Virginia. Even farther south you go, you're also going to run into some of these areas where the major engagements of our bloodiest conflict occurred. And I know, what we want to talk about was kind of the cultural ramifications of what was left over from that, and especially the work that was done very soon after and into the middle of the 20th century to really rebuild that American identity after it'd been so, ripped apart in such a bloody manner. So you are the actual historian. I did get a history degree, but I never made a living off of it. And maybe that might change. Who knows? But Mr. Coulombe, please take it away. I'm really honored to have you on, sir. Thank you again.
Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. And interestingly enough, I'm about to launch in May a second podcast with Pelican. I'm already to do one with them called Controlled Chaos. We just wrapped up doing a series on the history of the Holy Roman Empire. But we're going to be doing another one called Christ Haunted, Catholic America, the South, and you. And it'll be much more American focused than Controlled Chaos will be in my other work, and to some degree more Southern focused. Although you'll have noted I'm not really a Southerner myself at all. I'm a Yankees Yankee, I suppose you'd say. I was born in New York. Most of my life has been in California, and I'll be buried in Fall River, Massachusetts. So that's where the Coulombes all go to rest eventually, after lifetimes of dealing with insanity. But the question that you raise is an extremely important one, and it really goes to the very heart, to be honest with you, to the very heart of what the United States are all about. And these are questions, let me just say parenthetically, these are questions that are very important to us in this 250th year that nobody's celebrating. I mean, well, people are celebrating if you're a reenactor or you watch a reenactment, or you're anywhere near where these things happened. But unlike the bicentennial of 50 years ago, which I remember very well, I was a teenager, the semi-quincentennial, it's like nobody cares. And part of the reason why that is, I think, is because of a decay in American identity itself and because of the vast division that's reigning in our country, which I'm afraid is building up to proportions as bad as faced us in 1860, but with some few elements that make it a little bit worse. And to explain what I mean by that, I have to go back to our first Civil War, which was not the war between the states, the war of the rebellion, the war of northern aggression, the war of southern independence, call it what you will. It was our second Civil War. Our first Civil War stretched from 1775 to 1783. Then we commonly call it the American Revolution. Now, understand that from the time the 13 colonies were first settled, the French and Spanish colonies didn't have this problem. But the 13 colonies have always had a certain identity problem, because their makeup was extremely diverse, not just each of the 13 colonies, but within the colonies, within each of them. You had very different sorts of settlers, ethnically, religiously. Even, say, Massachusetts, which everyone looks at as colonial Massachusetts as a hub of unity rather than diversity. Don't you believe it? You have the Congregational established church, They had furious persecutions of heretics, like Baptists and Quakers. And they had Anglicans who could not be persecuted because it was the established church of the mother country, and the governor was often Anglican, but they were sneered at. They were kind of isolated. And then in the 18th century, the mid-18th century, you begin to have a wave throughout New England of conversions to Anglicanism. Well, this, as you can imagine, did not sit very well with the Connecticut and the Massachusetts, New Hampshire religious establishment. Rhode Island was a whole other issue. Rhode Island was Baptist. And they had tolerance for all creeds except Catholicism. Even Jews were okay, but not Catholics. And that kind of complete variance of diversity was true in every single one of the colonies. So, what was the source of unity then? Two things. One was the sort of moral consensus. Whatever your Protestant sect or a few Catholics and Jews, they basically believed the same things were right and wrong, and they could appeal to a common set of values, to a common set of ethics, even if their religious reasons for believing in them varied. So that was your basis. On top of that, you had a very furious loyalty to the king, in a lot of ways exceeding what you would get back in Britain, not least because in Britain you still had the remnants of the Civil War, you still had the Jacobites and so on. So, and the king was doubtless looked at with great respect, but in the colonies, he had an almost divine appearance. Why? Well, partly because, especially in the far north and the far south, he was seen as the protector of Protestantism against the evil Catholics, be they French in the north, be they Spanish in the south. Okay. So there we are in, say, the year of our Lord, 1770. Well, you've got in each of these colonies a sort of oligarchy that runs the show in reality. I mean, yeah, they're under the king, but the truth is the king is subject to Parliament, and the real power in each of these colonies is the local oligarchy. They run the assembly, they pay the governor's salary. If the governor gets into a fight with the assembly, he doesn't get any money. So that's one way they keep things very, very low. The four wealthiest men of the colonies in 1770 are George Washington, John Hancock, Philip Schuyler, and the only Catholic among them, Charles Carroll of Carrollton. These four. So it's important to understand this because the impetus for independence did not come from the population. It came from the people who already pretty much ran the show. And again, I'm not purely rambling here. There is a point to all of this. So when the revolution breaks out, one of the fascinating things is who the loyalists were, who stayed loyal to the king. Well, as with any civil war, you'll find all sorts of exceptions either way. I give you kind of a general thing. You can show me somebody that was the opposite. And that was true in every civil war that's ever been. But basically, the loyalists tended to be, apart from office holders who'd sworn oaths they didn't feel they could break, they tended to be the poorer people. They tended to be people of more neglected areas. Because remember, the people who are bringing you the revolution are the people who are already in charge. So in North Carolina, for instance, you had a rebellion against the provincial government in 1771, the Regulator War, because the assembly, not the governor, although he led the militia against the regulators, but the assembly had refused to appoint judges and courts and so forth for the western part of the colony, which meant that if you were a farmer or somebody out in western North Carolina and you had a legal problem, you had to make all your way to the east. And there are no sheriffs. There are sheriffs, but they're not very useful because they're far to the east. So the regulators revolted against the provincial government, demanding that judges and sheriffs and all that be appointed for the western half of the colony. Well, it was put down, but Interestingly, a few years later, most of the regulators become loyalists. Now, why is that? Well, it's because the people who've been pulling the strings in 1770 were bringing you the rebellion in 1775. And that same pattern goes throughout the colonies. Members of religious and cultural minorities in each colony, that varied from colony to colony, tended to be loyal rather than rebel. The less assimilated you were, for instance, if you were a Dutchman in New York, the more Dutch you were and less English speaking, the likelier you were to be loyalist, and vice versa. In New England, Anglicans tended to be loyalist. The Congregationalists tended to be rebel. Remember, they're the state church in New England. But in the South, where the Church of England was established, Anglicans tended to be rebel, and the Presbyterians, who tended to be Scots merchants, they tended to be loyal. So you don't get a one-size-fits-all in terms of beliefs and ethnicities, but you do get a feeling for what the thing was really about. And of course, there's John Adams' famous statement that only a third of the colonials supported independence. So, you know, and mind you, he would never have erred on the side of the loyalists. So you can't really look at the American Revolution and our first Civil War as a democratic thing, which is our mythology, but keep that mythology in mind. So now the rebels have a problem. They want to become independent, but how do we do that? Well, the first thing they came up with was appealing to the king to take over direct control of the colonies. Because remember, except for Georgia, all the American colonies have been founded under the House of Stuart, who had not ruled through Parliament. And so initially they had and had not been ruled by Parliament. So they had a direct connection with the king. And the party line became, well, you know, we're all for the king. We just don't want to be ruled by the government and Parliament. We want each of our legislatures to be like Parliament, and they'll rule over and through and with the king. Well, even if he'd wanted to, the king was not in a position to go along with that kind of a story, because he'd sworn allegiance to the Act of Supremacy, or the Act of Settlement, rather, which put his line on the throne in the first place. So that was a non-starter. It is true that he wanted to return the crown to where it had been under Queen Anne, but he did not want to get rid of the 1688 settlement. And of course, because of the revolution, he failed to do what he wanted to do in Britain. And he also lost interest in Catholic emancipation because of France and Spain coming into the war and making him feel betrayed. That's all other story. Having failed there, what's the next step? We attack the king, because he's this great symbol. That's why you'll notice, and people don't stop to think about this, the Declaration of Independence attacks the king for a whole bunch of things, except the king didn't do any of them except the Quebec Act. Why attack the king and not Parliament or the government? The answer is because they are going to use the same arguments that the glorious so-called rebels of 1688 used. And if they attacked Parliament, they'd really be attacking themselves. So they focus on the king, even though he really was not responsible for most of the measures that affected the colonies. Now, this is all psychological warfare. Thomas Paine will come up with his famous pamphlet, Common Sense, in which he comes up with an argument against monarchy that people have used ever since. And that is the argument from Scripture, from Samuel. God is angry with the people of Israel for wanting a king. Thomas Paine was the first one to use this. And the reason is that back in those days, people generally knew their Scripture a bit better. In Deuteronomy, God describes exactly what sort of a king he wants the people of Israel to have. The problem he had was that they didn't want his kind of king. They wanted somebody like the ones around them. So they did. They got Saul. But in time, he's replaced with a man after God's own heart, King David. But here's the fun part. Thomas Paine's an atheist. He doesn't believe in the Bible anyway. He boasts to John Adams about how powerful an argument that's been, how persuasive. But it's all garbage anyway. Ha ha ha. And John Adams is shocked. He writes about this in his diary. He's shocked that Paine was so coarse, so dismissive of his own audience. But you'll find that propagandists often tend to be. When they don't care about the truth, they don't really care about the people they're trying to persuade. Anyhow, all the war goes on. The French and Spanish come in. The British lose the war. You've got an independent country. September of 1783, these United States become an independent nation. King George absolves his subjects of their allegiance, and those who don't want to be absolved go to Canada or the Bahamas or Sierra Leone, or they go directly to Britain. All right. Well, now there's a problem. We still have that moral consensus, but what do we have for unity? The image of the king is gone. And that's why our initial few years are extremely chaotic. We have Shays' Rebellion and things like that. So what happens? Well, in the immediate aftermath of the Constitution, a group of men, including the famous Noah Webster, very consciously begin to create a religion of the country, a civic religion, which turns American history into a sort of salvation history. Moreover, because there's sort of a vague Calvinist background in the American mind, they're able to secularize a lot of, for want of a better word, tropes of the Calvinist mindset. So what happens? The American people, on the one hand, become, as the people of Israel were, and this is a very Calvinist thing, to radically identify with the people of Israel in the Old Testament. You'll find it with us, you'll find it with the Ulster Scots, you'll find it with the Afrikaners, you'll find it with the Scots, you'll find it with the Dutch. You read yourself into the Old Testament, and you reinterpret your history through that. So what happens? Well, now, you have a sort of, in this civic religion, which is never quite as explicit as I'm going to put it to you, but this is what it comes down to. You have a flight from Pharaoh coming to America, the great trek for the Afrikaners, going to Ireland for the Ulster Scots. You've left Pharaoh. You make your exodus. You arrive in a land filled with Canaanites, the Hottentots, and then the blacks in South Africa, the Irish in Ireland, and for us, the Indians, the French, and the Spanish. And then you set to work creating a new Eden. Well, this is the birth of American exceptionalism. And the old covenant, you might say, with the Pilgrim Fathers. Then you have the Revolution, which is reinterpreted as a kind of salvific moment, as a sort of, and Washington is almost equated with Christ, almost. But again, this isn't explicit. This is very implicit. Later on, as the country develops, this becomes a very quasi-religious thing. The president develops into the sort of high priest of the national cultus. The things like the 4th of July, of course, Washington's birthday, Flag Day, etc., get invested with not just a patriotic, but a quasi-religious thing. And that quasi-religious feeling can be participated in by Americans of any faith and none. And it's also based upon that moral consensus. Now, mind you, early 19th century, what I like to call the First Republic, the United States are still very autonomous. Each of them are still jealous of its own. My own native state of New York, only signed the Constitution upon the assurance that they could secede if they didn't like the results. But But they're developing along very, very different lines. In the north, what had been a merchant a merchant aristocracy gets out into banking and eventually industry. In the south, just keep doing it. And there are certain ongoing issues between the two. Slavery eventually becomes confined to the South, but I have to emphasize eventually. Now, one of the things that has to be remembered too, there's a lot of silliness around the slavery issue and the race issue. The first thing that has to be remembered, and this is probably one of the most important hate facts you'll ever learn. And just for those who don't know, a hate fact is something that's true but shouldn't be. And if you know it, you're evil.
Yep.
So that's a hate fact. So the little countries of the west coast of Africa, little kingdoms, for centuries have been fighting among themselves for the specific purpose of capturing prisoners to sell as slaves to the Arabs in the north. 1400s come along, the Tuaregs, who were a tribe of Berbers, revolt. They cut the caravan lines to North Africa from the west coast. And now the little kings have all of this human cargo and nobody to sell it to. Just when they would have torn their hair out, the white sails of the Europeans appeared. The gods of commerce smiled. And now there was a market again. But there are now and always have been more slaves in Africa than in America. And that's true to this day. We don't complain about the ones in Africa now because if we did, they'd smack us around and hurt us. So we just complain about the past and let the present be as nasty as possible. Anyway, I digress. So initially, during the colonial days, the great buyers and sellers of slaves were the New Englanders. And that was the days of the great triangle trade. The New England ships would bring rum from Massachusetts and the New England ports down to the west coast of Africa, trade it for slaves. They take the slaves to the West Indies, trade them for molasses, bring molasses back to New England and turn into rum. Mm-hmm. And that was the famous triangle trade. It went on legally until the year of our Lord, 1808. Now notice a couple of things that happened. All of the Catholic, well, not just Catholic, but all the monarchies of Western Europe, by that time had outlawed the slave trade. Both slaves in the mother countries had been freed. That was one reason for the settling of Sierra Leone. In 1798, the slavery in Great Britain was abolished, and any African slave living there could go to Sierra Leone, where there were already American loyalist blacks living. And that was really the beginning of Sierra Leone as a country. It's sort of an interesting parallel to their neighbor Liberia, whom we established. Mm-hmm. Anyhow, so long and the short of it is that the slave trade became illegal, but it continued for Americans, but it continued illegally really up until the beginning of the war between the states. The last slave ship to come to America was 1859. It was a Maine ship out of Portland, and they saw the Coast Guard coming, so they heaved into the Mobile, Alabama coast and dumped the cargo.
Wow!
And to this day, the descendants of that last cargo live there. A place called Africatown.
I was not aware of that. That's a really interesting anthropological fact. Wow.
Well, you're not supposed to be aware of these things. Mm. You know, I would recommend very highly a book by a woman called Zora Neale Hurston, who is one of the greatest writers the South ever produced, in my personal opinion. As a black lady and a sociologist, she died, I think, in late 50s, early 60s. But anyway, her book, Dust Tracks on a Road, which is her autobiography, is amazing. I also have to say that she came out with a novel in the 20s that was very scandalous, 100 years ago, 1920s, called The Seraph on the Swanee. And the reason why it was considered scandalous at the time, I hope you're seated. Yes, you are. I can see. All right. She's a black writer, right? A Southern black writer. She wrote a novel. I can almost, it's hard for me to get this out. She wrote a novel in which the major characters were white. Yeah, I know.
Wow.
How dare she? Who did she think she was? And she really, all kidding aside, she really got attacked from both sides.
Wow.
How dare she? So, at any rate, I digress. So, long and the short of it, as soon as the slave trade becomes illegal, it also becomes far less profitable. And suddenly New England discovers, oh my heavens, the South have slaves. Gee willikers. And so soon as slavery ceased to be financially profitable for New England, abolitionism arose. Now, it's interesting that most of the major abolitionists prior to that time had been Southerners and slave owners themselves. Yeah. And it was basically out of that we got things like the American Colonization Society that settled Liberia. And to this day, I've always felt that Liberia not being part of the United States was another great example of racism. We don't want to, same with the Philippines. We don't want to talk about our little children,
Yeah. Well, at least the Philippines was a territory, even if they never, I know like the citizens of the Philippines had a weird status. They were like aliens, like territorial, like they had some rights, but they didn't have
they had some rights. They were like Puerto Rico writ large. But I mean, the Philippines, that's a whole other issue, but we really messed them up pretty well. Liberia, we created. And the funny thing was the freed slaves that settled in Liberia turned around and enslaved the people around them. And they had plantations and all that, just like they left in the South, only everything as it were in blackface. And that was the case until they were called Americo-Liberians. They were an ethnic oligarchy. They ran Liberia pretty tightly, and nobody cared about that. And then they had a horrible, in the 70s, they had a horrible revolution, and the Americo-Liberians were slaughtered, and nobody cared about that either. You see, you want racism? I got racism for you. And that's a very good example. We didn't care about the way Liberia was run. We didn't care about the way the top class there ran the show. And then we didn't care about how they were slaughtered. You want racism? There it is. Zero in on that. But I digress. Because we're not finished with racism, I assure you. Everybody today wants racism, and I'm here to give it to you. Hard and good.
There's whole majors in it, so.
Oh man, Shevitz. We got racism, kids, right here in River City. Except the racists often aren't the people you think they are. But we'll keep that on the shelf for a moment. So anyway, one thing you got to bear in mind, though, about both North and South in those days is that they both, and we're still in the antebellum era, the First Republic, they both had definitely absorbed the national religion. You look at, arguably, our three first great novelists, who I would say were Washington Irving from New York, Nathaniel Hawthorne from Massachusetts, and Edgar Allan Poe, who was born in Boston but considered himself a Southerner, having been raised in Richmond and dying in Baltimore. So those three are holy trinity of early American writers. They were, all three of them, very patriotic in the sense of holding the national faith. And Irving, he was named after President Washington and met him when he was about 6 or 7 years old, because the capital was New York then. And he and his nurse were out one day, and there's the president. And the nurse rushes up and says, "This is my little George Washington. He was named after you, sir." And so Washington put his hand on Washington Irving's head and blessed him. So, I mean, if that isn't the American faith in operation, I don't know what is.
Yeah.
So At any rate, you'll notice that none of the three, Hawthorne lived the longest. He dies in 1864, and he doesn't see the end of the war. Longfellow survives the war, our first great poet, in my humble opinion. Irving dies in 59, and he's very afraid of what he sees on the horizon. And Poe, of course, dies in 1849. So he's quite a bit out of the picture when the war comes along. Stephen Foster, who we think of as a great Southern songwriter, was an American songwriter. He was from New Jersey. He died in New York, but he wrote about the South, having traveled there quite a bit. And there are a lot of things here that one has to bear in mind and that people don't. Slavery, by this time, had been abolished in the British Empire in 1833, and it was abolished peacefully. The slave owners were given cash compensation over a period of time. The slaves were liberated, and the result was very much what you see in the West Indies today, and what were the British West Indies. They're, more or less stable places, more or less. The racial issues are there, but they aren't the way they are with us. We're the only country that had to fight a very bloody civil war to end slavery. And again, that wasn't the only issue. When the Southerners say that slavery wasn't an issue, they're not telling you the truth. When the Northerners tell you it was the only issue, they're lying. They're both telling the truth, and they're both lying at the same time, which, oddly enough, is usually the case in any civil conflict, or for that matter, any marital conflict. But we'll leave that part aside. So the thing is then that all through this period, in with and under the war with Britain in 1812, the war with Mexico in the 1840s, the expansion of the frontier, the Indian Wars, etc., you have the jockeying for position between slave states and free states. Although, interestingly enough, the last northern state to give up slavery was Pennsylvania. And they only did it in 1859, I think. So, 1858. And New York had slavery, too, until the 1820s or 30s. So, it didn't vanish in the North all at once. The other thing you got to bear in mind is that people being people, human beings being human beings, and the law being the law, in the Catholic areas that were conquered, Louisiana, the Southwest, etc., slavery there had been a very different kind of institution. It was much more carefully regulated. If you fathered a child on a slave woman, you had to free her, you had to acknowledge the kids, you had to provide for them, which is why in New Orleans they used to say that the planters' white families were on Royal Street and their darker families on Bourbon. But that was why you had the rise there, and all along the Gulf Coast, Pensacola, Mobile, Biloxi, New Orleans, Galveston. You had the rise of the free people of color. Mm-hmm. And these folks, they were mixed, French and Spanish and black. They very often owned plantations and slaves of their own, and had educations in France, and were very much aware of their own position in life. But as soon as they came under American control, they had to fight to retain their position. Yet most of them came out for the South during the Civil War. One of the funny the funny things, there was a woman called Marie Laveau, who was the Queen of Voodoo. She was a black woman, freed slave, Queen of Voodoo in antebellum New Orleans. But she became a major fundraiser for the Confederacy. And she died a very devout Catholic, which I think if you're a voodoo queen is probably a wise career move.
Yeah.
I think that's, yeah, time to move along. You've had your fun. Let's get going. But
Yeah.
seriously, the uh, so the war came, and one of the interesting things about it, remember who the loyalists had been. The Second Civil War in the 13 oldest colonies reveals an interesting thing. In the north, you take the 13 oldest states. Those areas in the north, those that stayed part of the Union, those areas that had been loyalist tended to be Copperhead. That is, they opposed the war. They opposed fighting to keep the southern states in the Union. But in the southern states, the old ones, those areas that had been loyalist tended to be Unionist. Now, again, stop and think about this. What does this mean? What does this tell us? What it tells us is that both secession, on the one hand, and the urge to reconquer the states on the other were decisions made by the dominant sorts. And those areas that felt left out or neglected were not keen on this glorious crusade, whether it was for states' rights or for the glorious Union. Because the same people who usually smack them around and tax them and abuse them in other ways suddenly come up to them, as they had to their grandfathers in the 1770s, and said, "We have a glorious crusade. We who have owned you until this moment, we want you to spend your money and shed the blood of your children. Come on." And the response was the same. I don't think I like that very much. I mean, you annoy me and tax me and smack me around normally. Why do I want to spend and die for you? I don't get it.
It's like a rich man's war. That's how they kind of view it.
Kind of like every war, one way or the other.
So I get that definitely explains to, a lot of people are very confused when they see West Virginia, ironically enough, seceding from Virginia, having already seceded. They didn't feel culturally, and also, there is that class delineation, their social delineation. We're not part of, that class over there.
No.
And we don't want to fight as part of that.
And West Virginia, or the then settled parts of West Virginia, had been a hotbed of Toryism during the Revolution. Same impulse. Turn it around, the eastern shore of Maryland, southern Jersey, they were Copperhead territory, but they had been loyal during the war, during the first one. So, people are funny. You give them a cause that's going to cost them their children and their money that they don't believe in, and they tend not to support it. I don't get it. People are weird. Why don't they just, wait?
It's a good thing that doesn't happen now, right? That can never happen now.
God, no. Well, that became illegal thanks to the Perfection Act of 1960, when everything became wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
I was born the day it was passed.
Wow, that's a crazy coincidence. I never would have guessed.
Isn't that strange?
Yeah.
Remember, self-delusion is the key to positive thinking. Remember that.
I've
lived my whole career on that basis, and I never mind. Anyway, so the war is horrible. It's terrible. It's bloody. It is the worst conflagration that we've ever seen. It ends, and several things happen. Firstly, one of the interesting things about the war, remember that moral consensus. Both sides appealed to it. Both sides, now you had, in the build-up to the revolution, the three major Protestant churches split over slavery and the other issues. Northern and Southern Baptists, Northern and Southern Methodists, Northern and Southern Presbyterians. The Episcopal Church did not split. The Catholic Church did not split. The Catholic Church couldn't because of the way it's set up. The Episcopal Church did have the Episcopal Church of the Confederate States of America, which seceded in 1860, and returned almost immediately the war was over. And that, believe me, has nothing to do with how committed to the cause Episcopalians were. General Lee was a very devout Episcopalian, and one of the most famous generals of the Confederate Army in the far South was Bishop Leonidas K. Polk, the Episcopal Bishop of Louisiana, who traded his vestments for a gray uniform at the beginning of the war. So trust me when I tell you, the rush of the Episcopalians to reunite after the war, as opposed to the other three, has very little to do with how fervent they were in their stance either way, and a lot more to do with their desire to bury the hatchet. And that brings us to an important couple of points. I always say that the second worst thing to happen to the South in the Civil War, other than being defeated, was Abraham Lincoln's murder. Because the thing about Lincoln, and people really don't understand this, he really was only interested in preserving the Union. That was all he cared about, really and truly. If the Southern states had suddenly dropped their weapons and said, readmit us in 1864, he'd have jumped at it. He wasn't going to negotiate their reentrance, but he wanted them back in as soon as possible with as little muss, as little fuss as possible, which is why, the famous story of his having Dixie played by the band a week before he died, and his famous "with charity to all, with malice toward none" speech. Now, I'm not a great Lincoln fan, nor am I a great Lincoln hater. But, you try to accept the man as he was, you're trying to figure him out. And the truth is, he just wanted the whole thing over. Even more, the Emancipation Proclamation itself it didn't affect any of the slaves in the Union or in the Union-occupied areas. He was, if anything, personally speaking, he wanted all the blacks sent to Liberia. He was hardly a great proponent of black freedom. Nevertheless, he ended up doing it. Of course, I, for one, am glad he did. But slavery was on its way out in any case. Jefferson Davis made a deal with the Papal States. The deal was that slavery would end 5 years after the end of hostilities if the Holy See recognized the Confederacy as a sovereign nation. And Davis himself was a fascinating character. He tried to convert when he was 14 years old. The Dominicans who were teaching him at his school in Kentucky would not accept him because they said, "You're too young, you better wait." He had the scapular, he had the rosary, and the Archbishop of New Orleans marched in his funeral procession, which has led me to wonder if he converted on his deathbed. But whether or not he did, when he was a prisoner in Fortress Monroe in Virginia after the war, Pope Pius IX sent him a picture of himself with the words in Latin, "Come to me, all you who are heavy burdened and labor," and a crown of thorns that he made himself. And these are available for inspection at the Confederate Hall in New Orleans, Louisiana. Another place worth seeing, by the way, is his old home, Beauvoir, in Mississippi, in Biloxi. So the war ends. Davis is a prisoner. Lincoln is shot, and the radical Republicans are going to have their pound of flesh, and that pound of flesh is Reconstruction. Now, Reconstruction involves what? Well, it involves several things. The slaves are free. They're given voting rights. They're given all that. Anyone who has served the rebel government is deprived of their civil rights. They can't vote. More importantly, they can't bear witness in court. Now, why is that important? Because if you can't bear witness in court, you can't press charges against somebody. So in other words, if I'm deprived of that right, you can come in, take my stuff, smack me around, kill my wife, and worse. And I can't do anything about it. That was what Reconstruction meant in the day-to-day. And it poisoned the relationship between the races in ways that we have not yet recovered from. However, that having been said, a decade of that goes by, and the Northern Republicans realize they could use Southern white votes. So they make a deal with the Southern white leadership. And that deal is, we'll give you your civil rights back if you let the blacks keep theirs. And they said, sure. So they got their civil rights back, and that's the end of Reconstruction. And there followed a golden 15 years in which that now very elderly generation continued to run the South and kept the gentleman's agreement. So the time of Reconstruction, where you had blacks as governors and senators who couldn't read, that ends. But you also don't have Jim Crow either. You've got this period where the races are coexisting. During that period, two men stand out in particular as apostles of racial reconciliation in the South. And their names are Pierre Toussaint Gustave de Beauregard, General Beauregard, and Nathan Bedford Forrest. In fact, in the 1870s, Forrest would do something absolutely shocking. Shocking. I do hope you're seeing. Oh, you are. You're fine. Are you ready for this?
Hit me.
There's a meeting of a black group in Kentucky, a big public affair called the Defenders, I think they were called. Forrest is the guest speaker. He's presented by the president of the organization and his wife, both black. He kisses her on the cheek. Dun, dun, dun. In public, in front of people. This was a shock. Woo! It was like Zora Neale Hurston daring to write a novel with white protagonists. Who are these people? Where do they get off? That's what I want to know. Well, now Forrest is interesting too because he's mostly renowned as a founder of the famed Ku Klux Klan.
Yeah. So
you might wonder, how do you reconcile all of this stuff together with Forrest? Well, it's actually quite simple if you're not a moron. If you are a moron, then woo, woo. But if you aren't a moron, and if you know how human nature works, here are the facts. Number one, he commanded black troops during the Civil War. Now, if you command troops, you tend to know something about them and get to like them. He came from a kind of a poor family, and I don't believe he had any slaves when he was young. If he did, not many. But he commanded them in wartime. So that kind of fixed his view of blacks, soldiers serving under him. So then the war ends. We're in this horrific situation with no civil rights that I mentioned. If you've seen the movie Gone with the Wind, there's a famous scene where Scarlett O'Hara is attacked and she's saved by one of the blacks, but her menfolk decide to go do justice for her. And that's it's a poignant scene, and that's actually not dissimilar to real life. At any rate, what should happen but that Forrest co-founds the Ku Klux Klan as a sort of white defense organization, but not as an anti-black thing. And here, you've got. I realize the modern mind has trouble making distinctions.
Nuance? What is that? What's nuance?
I know. We're supposed to be stupid, and mind you, we're good at it. We got dumb nailed down. But white defense, not anti-black. However, a moron could easily make the jump, not just in theory the way we moderns would, but in real life the way they did. So the Klan turned into an anti-black organization. And Nathan Bedford Forrest wiped his hands of it because that's not what he signed up for. That's not what he wanted. And then we have the famous scene with the Defenders. Now, having said all of this good stuff, and this is what makes the irony of having Forrest and Beauregard statues pulled down in the name of racial equality. I mean, again, when stupid runs the show, bad things happen.
Yeah, sky's the limit. Yeah.
Stupiditas omnia vincit. Oh, sorry. Anyway, you know, the one thing worse is when you start hearing a mob behind me doing the same cheer. Stupiditas omnia vincit. Yes, yes.
Yeah, you gotta
Anyway.
be careful. You might start a movement. Yeah, you say it too loud.
Yeah, I know. And believe me, they'd adopt me as their headman. You know?
Yeah. Well, I mean, they're looking
Chief moron Coulombe.
Both parties are looking for prospective nominee right now here in the U.S. So you gotta be careful. You gotta be careful.
Yeah, believe me, if somebody could openly run on the stupid party, he'd win. But unfortunately, the never-ending prejudices and discrimination are still with us to that degree. Yeah. You can't come out and say you're an idiot. You can only do it by your works and your actions. You can't actually say I'm a big moron. But the time will come, ladies and gentlemen. Freedom is coming.
You have to remember my channel name is TradTards. Maybe I'm a trailblazer.
See, freedom is coming.
Yeah,
it's coming. The glory train. It's gonna take all us morons to heaven.
All right, the manifesto comes out next week, so
put my name on it. It doesn't matter how stupid it is. If it's idiotic, in common with our masters, I support it. But I digress. So what happens then? You've got this Reconstruction comes to an end. Something else is happening now, and that something else is a reconciliation between North and South. And I got to tell you, this is one of the things I am proudest of as an American. I really am. Because in any other country, a war that bloody, that caused that much misery and suffering, not just amongst military people, but amongst the civilian populations, especially in the South, it would be like Ulster. It would be like Liberia. It would be a never-ending wound. It would just keep bleeding and pullulating, and it would never end. But what happened? Well, something funny. Have you ever heard of a holiday called Decoration Day?
Can't say I have, actually, no.
Well, you have, but not under that name, and I'll explain why.
Oh, Juneteenth.
What's that?
No. Did I guess wrong?
What did you guess?
Juneteenth was that the original? No, okay. No. I'll edit that out. I said that so confidently.
Yeah, well, it's okay. Don't feel bad about it.
All right.
And personally, I'm happy that Juneteenth is now a federal holiday. I'm all for that. But
I'll take a day off.
No. I mean, I'm happy about emancipation. I mean, my heavens, where would we be without it? It's just too bad everyone could have been emancipated. But if you don't believe me, ask the infants. But moving on, what should happen but that in the South, and there are like 5 or 6 different towns that claim to be the first one where it happened. Honestly, they could all be telling the truth because it started out fairly early. What happened was, in each of these towns, you had a group of women, basically widows and mothers, bereft mothers of Confederate soldiers, who went to decorate the graves of their loved ones. Well, of course, in each of these places, there had been Union troops who had also been killed, and they were buried. But there was no one to tend their graves. So the Southern women thought that was very sad, and they took to decorating those graves as well, even though these were very often the men who had killed their own. And that was the beginning of what was called Decoration Day. And within 10 years, it had spread throughout the United States. Now, after World War I, we renamed it Memorial Day. But that was its origin. And then, of course, later on, for reasons I'll touch on momentarily, the the Confederates, the Southerners came up with their own version, Confederate Memorial Day, which is on different days in different states in the South. Confederate Heroes Day, Lee Jackson Day, King Lee Day. I've always liked that because Martin Luther King and Robert E. Lee were born within a day of each other. And I could always see some idiot going, King Lee Day? Who's this King Lee? I ain't celebrating no monarch. Yeah, I'm sure you aren't.
Well, that, as a Virginian, for a time, it was Lee Jackson King Day.
Yeah.
They also threw Stonewall in there, too. I mean, it was a very unique cultural occurrence. I believe that ended in the 90s. That's how long it lasted.
Well, and I think that's a decent thing. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not a Martin Luther King fan, but he played an important role. And nobody's going to be celebrating no Franco-American heroes, so I gotta accept that everybody else is going to have theirs. Oh, I'm sorry. Was that resentment boiling up from me? Never mind.
No, so, you got Lafayette. That's the best you're going to get. You're going to get Lafayette. That's.
As I was saying before, I was interrupted by the man in the mask. Who was that masked man? Anyway, oh, I don't know. He's already written on. The guy with the Indian. The thing was that the coming back together of the country was nothing short of miraculous. Now, meanwhile, in the South, starting about 1890, you have the onset of, you guessed it, Jim Crow. Now, one of the major nails in the coffin, you might say, for Jim Crow was Plessy versus Ferguson. Mm-hmm. Homais Plessy was a very devout Catholic French speaker from New Orleans, one of the gens de couleur that we mentioned earlier, the free people of color. And he was denied a place in a whites-only thing on the train and went all the way up to the Supreme Court and gave us Plessy versus Ferguson. As a knight of Peter Claver, Homais Plessy is a little bit of a hero of mine, I don't mind saying. But I will say, beyond that the way that Jim Crow was brought in was pretty nasty because it involved playing games with things that should never have been played with. What do I mean by that? I'm going to tell you right out. I believe in literacy tests for voting. If you can't read and write, I don't care who you are, you've got no business. Because if you're not paying any other kind of tax, you're not paying income tax, you're not paying property tax, well, you got to pay something. You've got to show some commitment to the system. Unfortunately, in bringing in Jim Crow, they use these things in a racial manner. So the literacy tests, for a white voter, prove you can read and write. Okay, you're in. Black voter, they give him a page of Latin to translate. Illiterate. The grandfather clause, you could only be a voter if your grandfather had been one. Well, that took care of the freed slaves, didn't it? And the racializing of the poll tax, which, you're white, well, you only pay $5. You're black, $250. Well, that was a horrible, horrible abuse of the system, and it would be used by the Supreme Court later on to knock out literacy tests and poll taxes because of the way they've been applied. And there's an important lesson there. And I don't care who hears it or what anybody thinks of it, when you mess with the system, when you use it not for the common good, but to accomplish your specific goal, you open the path for your opponents. They will get you one day using your weapons. Mm-hmm. That's why if you're in power, you should play it straight. Play by the rules. Because if you don't, your opponents will do what you did. And then where will we be? So a warning to the wise if you're ever running a state or a country or, a PTA or something. Anyway, so this is all occurring at the same time. But a funny thing happened under Jim Crow. And that was that in some cases with, in some cases without white help, the blacks built up a whole network of educational institutions, businesses, schools, and you have the continuing emergence of a black middle class. And all this happened under Jim Crow. It wasn't, I mean, this is why if you study the period carefully, I'm going to say something that's going to sound terribly patronizing, but for reasons that'll be clear momentarily, I hope. I don't care. If you study it carefully, you cannot believe that the blacks are stupid as a race. Now, I said it because people do believe that. You know how I know? I know because the largest single cause of death amongst young black men in this country is other young black men, and nobody cares. And you know why they don't care? They being the media, the government, and the education industry. Do you know why they don't care? Because they are racists. They think blacks are stupid. They think they're incapable. They treat them like children or subhuman. And that's why they have all of these things they do. Well, you can't expect a black man to be able to do anything. There's nothing to me more insulting than it came out during COVID, the marks of whiteness thing from the African American Museum at the Smithsonian. You know what they said in that bloody thing? I believe I saved it. So this is from the National Museum of African American History and Culture at the Smithsonian. And it was issued in, it'll tell us at the bottom, it was issued in 2020. Now, there was kind of an uproar over it, so they had to get rid of it. Listen to this. Aspects and assumptions of whiteness and white culture in the United States. White dominant culture, or whiteness, refers to the ways white people and their traditions, attitudes, ways of life have been normalized over time and are now considered standard practices in the United States. And since white people still hold most of the institutional power in America, we have all internalized some aspects of white culture, including people of color. All right, let's listen to this. Rugged individualism. The individual is the primary unit. Self-reliance, independence and autonomy highly valued and rewarded. Individuals assumed to be in control of their environment. You get what you deserve. Family structure. The nuclear family. Father, mother, 2.3 children is the ideal social unit. Husband is breadwinner and head of household. Wife is homemaker and subordinate to the husband. Children should have own rooms, be independent. Emphasis on scientific method. Objective, rational, linear thinking. Cause and effect relationships. Quantitative emphasis. History. Based on Northern European immigrants' experience in the United States. Heavy focus on the British Empire. The primacy of Western, Greek, Roman, and Judeo-Christian tradition. Well, yeah, what else do we have again? What language are you writing in? What structure produced you? What academic did? Protestant work ethic. Hard work is the key to success. Work before play. If you didn't meet your goals, you didn't work hard enough. Religion. Christianity is the norm. Anything other than Judeo-Christian tradition is foreign. No tolerance for deviation from single God concept. Oh no, I worship my masters, as I'm supposed to. Status, power, and authority. Wealth equals worth. Your job is who you are. Respect authority. Heavy value on ownership of goods, space, property. Time. Follow rigid time schedules. Time viewed as a commodity. Future orientation. Plan for future. Delayed gratification. Progress is always best. Tomorrow will be better. Aesthetics. Based on European culture. Steak and potatoes. Bland is best. Now this part, to be fair.
Oh, that's just straight rude.
What's that?
That's just so rude, man. I mean,
it gets better. The woman who wrote this thing, there's a chick who wrote this, some academic creature who probably couldn't get a date when she was in school. But she writes, woman's beauty based on blonde, thin, quote unquote, Barbie. Well, I can guess what she was like, but never mind. Man's attractiveness based on economic status, power, and intellect. Yeah, women should go for men who are jobless, weak, and stupid. Okay, I get it. Holidays based on Christian religions, based on white history and male leaders. Oh boy, like Juneteenth. Justice. Well, Juneteenth was an action of a white leader. So yeah, I get that.
Yeah.
No, it's true.
Yeah.
Justice based on English common law. Protect property and entitlements. Intent counts. Competition. Be number one. Win at all costs. Winner-loser dichotomy. Action orientation. Master and control nature. Must always do something about a situation. Aggressiveness and extroversion. Decision-making. Majority rules when whites have power. And lastly, communication. The King's English rules, written tradition. Avoid conflict, intimacy. Don't show emotion. Don't discuss personal life. Be polite. Well, having said all of this, you have this weird combination of stereotyping on the one hand, and on the other hand, attacking any quality which will actually help you do anything in life. And this is something that's been imposed on blacks who shouldn't have to do any of that. The real message is that they're not capable. And I'm here to tell you, the history of the Black American under Jim Crow gives the lie to everything that woman wrote there. They are quite capable. They did an awful lot. There's a reason we have Black Congressional Medal of Honor winners. It didn't drop out of a tree. This is the kind of thing that drives me crazy. And it's a way of keeping them dependent and down on the old plantation, albeit a plantation where they don't do anything and make nothing. The state song of Virginia, up until the little ones got upset, was called "Carry Me Back to Old Virginia."
Mm-hmm.
Now, I used this a number of times as a diagnostic test to see if students could think. I would give them the lyrics, and I'd say, what would the modern mind find most objectionable about this song? Well, it opens up, "Carry me back to old Virginia." That's where this old darky thought him long to go. And if you're an idiot, that's what you see that, and your brain overloads, the steam starts coming out of your ears, and all that. But if you've got a brain, you'll see the real problem is in the last verse. Now, bear in mind, James Bland, the author of the thing, was an ex-slave. He made a fortune as a songwriter after the war. We're not supposed to talk about successful blacks, I know. But, Aunt Jemima died a millionaire, but we'll leave that alone. Thank God we banned her image. I mean, anyhow, sorry, calm down, Charles. It's all right. See, this is what comes of having parents who are active in civil rights. I grew up with Black history. But that's a whole other issue. What happens? The song, the last verse goes, "Massa and Mrs. have long gone before me. Soon we'll be together on that golden shore. There we'll be happy and free from all sorrow, and never again depart no more." Now, this doesn't mean slavery was a wonderful thing. What it does mean is that, as in every other element of human life throughout history, it was human beings adapt. There were terrible Simon Legree masters, you bet, just as there were factory owners in the North who happily watched their people work from dusk till dawn, and as soon as somebody got sick, threw them out on his ear. That was the reality for Northern factory workers for a long time. We don't talk about that. Especially when it was impossible to buy anymore. The slave trade had come to an end. Slaves became very valuable commodities, and so had to be nursed through sickness. and taken care of. And again, human beings, that became a sort of personal relationship. You know, the story, and again, I hate to see use Gone with the Wind, but not Blanche Dubois, that's Streetcar Named Desire. Scarlett O'Hara's. Sorry, getting all my southern stuff mixed up. You know, I gotta have me some corn pone and grits in a minute. Anyhow, boy, we getting lost in the stereotypes, you know.
TradTards is a safe space. It's all right. Yeah, you're good.
I gotta have me some molasses and corn pones in a minute. So, what should I? Yeah. Oh, hey, I do declare it is so hot here on the veranda.
Yeah. Come down with a case of the vapors over here.
Yeah, maybe my smelling salts. All right, let's calm down. I'm sorry. Man, Blanche Dubois, yeah. Scarlett O'Hara, sorry.
Yes.
Her
the greatest Southern Catholic who never existed, Scarlett O'Hara.
Yep, she did. Well, yeah, although she and Blanche Dubois might have been related, I think. They were both, Blanche's creator, Tennessee Williams, he was a drama queen. But anyway, moving along. So Blanche and, forget Blanche, Scarlett O'Hara. Her mother dies treating the white crash chick for cabin fever. Well, that happened, and it very often fell to the lady of the plantation to become doctor and nurse. Now, that's sort of a setup, to say nothing of the sad, ugly side, if you will, of miscegenation. And again, this was a difference. As I said earlier, the French Code Noir required you to acknowledge your children. In the English-speaking areas, not only was that not the case, but you would get more money for slaves who looked white, and a lot of slaves looked white at the end of the war. I had a funny experience driving to Connecticut with a friend of mine. I was telling him all this stuff about the Code Noir, the Jean de Couleur, and how in the English-speaking world you'd get a better price for white-looking slaves. We get to Harriet Beecher Stowe's house in Hartford. She was the authoress of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Yep. And one of the things they had out are a picture of a group of slave children at emancipation. They all look white. And my friend, who I don't think really believed me, he looked at that. This, I've been telling this like 40 minutes before in the car. He looks at this, he says, my God, they all look white. I said, what? I told you.
Yeah.
But people don't know these things. They don't understand them. So the relationships were much more intricate than anybody gives them credit for, than anybody understands. To this day, one of the things my sort of BS test on racial relations, I'll ask a Northerner, do you like blacks? Oh, yeah, they're great. That's nice. Do you know any personally? The Southerner, how do you feel about blacks? Well, often enough, really? Do you know any personally? Oh, yeah. Well, which ones of them do you dislike? All I can tell you is that you'll get the same sort, in reverse, the same sort of hypocrisy amongst blacks. So, human beings, if we have nothing else in common other than our ancestry and our descent from Adam and Eve, it's our love of hypocrisy. But I digress. So, what should happen? That's all Jim Crow and all that. But in the meantime, something else is happening. And now we're in the 1890s, the 1900s, into the 20s. And what's happening? I have to say, you have the evil President Wilson imposed Jim Crow on the District of Columbia. Why does he do that? He's raised in Virginia during Jim Crow. Not Jim Crow, sorry, during Reconstruction. So, he's got PTSD in the White House and he's seeing blacks everywhere. So he was not a very stable man. So he puts in segregation and feels better. Anyhow, long and the short of it is that the work of reconciliation continued. Weirdly enough, the Spanish-American War and the whole growth of American exceptionalism, Teddy Roosevelt, the big stick, this all helped pull the two sections back together to a great degree. But something else happened, and that was the two sides continued to commemorate their own heroes and so on, and they were allowed so to do. This is what is commonly called the myth of the lost cause in the South, and which should be called the myth of the glorious Union in the North. And they were both myths, and they were both true, but what they also became was sort of varying sects within that national religion I spoke of. And there was some crossover, but you can think of them as being like Sunni and Shiite, with the southern variant. Nevertheless, they're connected in origin, which is why Washington was a hero for both. You may remember that the seal, the Great Seal of the Confederacy, showed Washington on a horse.
Actually,
yep, Deo Vindice, that's the one. And Light Horse Harry Lee, of course, was the grandfather of General Lee, so Robert E. Lee. Incidentally, though, there were a lot of Copperheads and a lot of Southern Unionists. Amongst Southern Unionists' families, one produced a man called Huey Long, who became governor of Louisiana. And in the North, you've heard of the quintessential New England poet, Robert Frost. Well, he came of an old New Hampshire family, all right, and we think of him as the quintessential New Englander, but he was born in San Francisco in 1864. Why was he born in San Francisco? Because his father had to leave his native New Hampshire. And why did he have to leave his native New Hampshire? Well, guess what Robert Frost's middle name was?
Lee?
Yep. Robert Lee Frost. So the quintessential New Englander, and this is in a certain sense, the great amusement and the great wonder of the American identity. Scratch a Yankee, you'll find a Southerner. Scratch a Southerner, you'll find a Yankee. They may have their issues, but they're a lot more like each other than they are like anybody else. And that goes double for blacks and triple for Indians, just so you know. Anyway, so what happens? Well, you have this, you have the Confederate monuments go up in the South, you have Union monuments go up in the North, and they coexist fairly easily. You have the shared Memorial Day, Decoration Day morphs into it. And then, of course, you have World War I and then World War II. And these two conflicts bring the different parts of the country together and waters down ethnicities in a way that had never been the case before. As kind of a useful exercise if you've got the time, and even if you don't. You may remember President Franklin Roosevelt, who ran the country from 33 to 45. Well, of course, he had the New Deal, and the New Deal did all sorts of things. It might not have gotten us out of the Depression. It took World War II to do that. But it certainly made a lot of stuff. Beautiful buildings. And, my family were very anti-Roosevelt on both sides. But there was one part of the New Deal. All the rest of it was evil and from Satan. But there was one part of the New Deal that was divinely blessed and only for the good. And that was the Federal Writers Project. Because that was the only thing I could have gotten a job in. So, I'm sorry, that came out wrong. All right, maybe I exaggerate slightly. But it is the only thing I could have gotten a job in. But the Federal Writers Project, which worked like all the others, gave work to unemployed writers, of whom there were more than a few. And it was set up on a state-by-state case. So they produced a whole series of guides to the United States. The Federal Writers Project state guides. Now, there are also guides to different cities, sections of different states, depending on how much time and interest the local writers had. But at the very least, they would produce a state guide. And then there's also a lot of unpublished material they gathered. They went to every corner of their respective states. I mean, they found all sorts of really fascinating stuff. And at a very minimum, those 49 state guides, they didn't do Hawaii, they didn't do Puerto Rico, and they did Alaska, which were territories. Those state guides give you an incredibly intricate and intense and detailed snapshot of what the United States were like on the edge of World War II. And I guarantee you, if you really want to fall in love with your particular state, or all of them, again, read the state guide to your state, or as many of them as you can. You read them all, and I have to admit, I have read them all. It took me a few years, but I read them all. You're not going to retain it all, at least I haven't, but it'll give you a real feeling just for the multiplicity and the diversity of this country and the incredible things there are here. You'll never look at the country the same way again. Anyway, even better, by the way, if you can get a copy of it and go driving around the way they suggest you to.
Oh, wow,
Despite the fact that 90 years have gone by, it's amazing how much of it is still around. At any rate, I mention all this because if our first republic was the period between 1783 or 1789 in the Constitution and, say, 1860, our second republic was 1865 to 1941. That, in my humble opinion, was the apogee of the American identity, of the American nationality. We weren't yet the colossus, the empire of the earth, nor were we a semi-independent federation. We were what we now recognize as American. This was the country of Irving Berlin and Norman Rockwell, George M. Cohan, and for what it was pretty neat. That's where all the things we talked about earlier came out of. Jazz and the cocktail, for that matter, the polio vaccine, the airplane, the telephone, the extension of the telegraph. We did a lot of stuff. You'll find that Americans, we may not do great art, but we do pretty good art. It was the golden age of illustration, the golden age of radio, the golden age of Hollywood, the golden age of Broadway, the golden age of comic books, the golden age of detective fiction, the golden age of pulp fiction. All of that period. It was an amazing time. And that was the bulk of the period that created the America that I knew when I was a kid.
One thing about that, I mean, part of that period as well, tying this kind of into the discussion on the reunification, this was the period when all these monuments go up, right? Exactly. I mean, you have things, and it wasn't just about the Civil War. I mean, for every, conflict we've been in, every historical moment, things for Columbus, the Columbian expositions that occurred during that period. I mean, there's literally some very not smart people who think that the grandeur of the Columbian expositions was like some lost civilization, and it's evidence of such. They made these, especially in Chicago, the giant, very, neoclassical structures that were temporary, but it does go to show that there was this American sense during this period that led to this artistic explosion that more often than not lasted, with monuments that, weren't going to go away, in a few months.
Oh, sure. And I mean, you look at architectural styles. The arts and crafts movement came to America and exploded. So you have your California bungalow, but you had the colonial revival, mission revival. I mean, all sorts of revival movements. You had Queen Anne revival, which she's got nothing to do with Queen Anne, so far as I can figure out. But I'm sure she wouldn't mind. It's like Blackbeard's ship, the Queen Anne's Revenge. I don't know what it had to do with anything, but all right, fine. You had the City Beautiful movement, where from Pasadena, California to Boston, city planners set out to make their given city as beautiful a collection of beautiful buildings and parks and so on as possible. That's where the National Mall really came from in D.C., Central Park in New York. The Common in Boston got sort of repurposed.
I'll do you one.
Yeah.
Monument Avenue in Richmond.
In Richmond, absolutely.
Yep.
And then, of course, after the First War, the colonial revival really gets underway. And it started really with the centennial in 1876. But after the war, when you get people like Henry Ford and John D. Rockefeller into it, you have the recovery of Williamsburg. You have the what do you call it? My mind's going. That village by Dearborn that Ford endowed. It's a museum village, Greenwood or something. I've been there. You had, I think it was Rockefeller bought the Wayside Inn in Sudbury, Mass, and returned it to its original state. And you had all this sort of stuff going on. And was there bad stuff happening too? Yeah, you had Prohibition, you had the Klan, you had all sorts of stuff. But bear something in mind, and this is something, again, the modern mind has a little trouble with, not being too steady on its feet. Crap you will always have with you. Every society has garbage, has sin, has crime. You will never escape this. So what do you compare on? What can you compare? Not the lowest, but the highest. What great artwork does it produce? What is the general standard of living? Where do most people fit in? What is the nature of the leadership, and what do they believe? Are they willing to die for it before they have you die for it? That's the difference between a Blessed Emperor Karl and a Woodrow Wilson. But these are the sorts of questions you have to ask. Now, we don't ask those questions because if we do, it destroys the accepted narrative of victimhood, of infantilization. Basically, all of our narrative today is intended to reduce us to one-on-ones who need to be taken care of. COVID was beautiful from that standpoint. We were living in one international nursery, all of us cared for by our owners in the best way possible, of course. So, having said all of that, World War II comes along, and if anything accentuates the American religion, I mean, out of that, you get mythic things like the four chaplains, who have several temples to them to this day. You have so much of our American national religion was based upon warfare and victory. Because, again, the national religion was dedicated to a sort of abstract freedom. But you never define it. America is about freedom. It's about liberty. Okay, liberty to what? Freedom to what are we talking? No, don't ask those questions. Just move along. But people were willing to die for it. The flag, I mean, to me, when I look at the flag, I don't see some symbol of abstract freedom. I see the flag my fathers died under. I see the symbol of the country I love that I've lived in most of my life. It doesn't need to represent anything more than that. It's just that my family doesn't have to be any more than my family. My dad didn't have to be an astronaut. My mother didn't have to be Mother of the Year. Well, I digress. So the Second War comes along. We become the arsenal of democracy. And then comes the Cold War. Well, now several things happen all at once. Firstly, thanks to our part in defeating the Axis and in keeping communism off from Western Europe and elsewhere, we become not simply dedicated to freedom at home, we become the great guardians of freedom around the world. And the president becomes the head of the free world. We have Eisenhower after Truman. And Eisenhower, a man more designed to be a sort of non-denominational minister of the national cult, you can't imagine. He used to say, our system cannot work without religion, and I don't care what it is, as long as it's got something about men being equal in it. You know, there's nothing quite like that dogmatic certainty. But that very vagueness is what made the national religion possible. Now, and it's in everything, you know, the Pledge of Allegiance, the in God we trust, one nation under God, even the Supreme Court, which since the 1950s has done everything it could to destroy the position of religion in everyday life. How does every session start out? God save the United States and this honorable court. Okay, sure. And every year, and you know, for the past, I don't know, 80 years maybe. Once a year, the Supremes make the trek to St. Matthew's Cathedral in Washington, very often with the president of the day and various other the supposedly great and good, for the Red Mass, in which the Cardinal Archbishop of Washington invokes the Holy Ghost down upon them in their decisions. This is wonderful and it's horrible all at the same time. I mean, really? Yes. It's a great conundrum. Anyhow, so the 50s too were the last heyday of that moral consensus upon which everything rested. But now, November the 8th, 1960, I was born. Hi, everybody. I'm here. But beyond that, and actually, much as it hurts me to tell you this, more importantly, John F. Kennedy was elected president of the United States, the first Catholic we'd ever had. Now, all during this time we've talked about, the Catholic Church had a sort of gentleman's agreement of its own. In return for not evangelizing to any great degree, we'd be allowed a place at the table. We could be respectable, like our Protestant betters. And so we finally got one of our own in the White House, you know, son of a bootlegger. I'm sorry, son of an ambassador, I meant. So there we are. It's 1960. The church is in seemingly a very good position in America. Fulton Sheen, his show is outdoing even Uncle Milty on TV. As early as 1928, one Catholic archdiocese, the Archdiocese of Chicago, bailed out the Holy See from going bankrupt. Now, the Holy See's finances were put back in order the following year with the Lateran Treaty. But they wouldn't have been in a position to do that if Cardinal, is a German name, and I can't think of it, of Chicago hadn't bailed them out. So, after 1945, with ruined Europe, etc., the American church becomes the most financially stable part of the church. And Americanism seems to look very, very, very good to a lot of Catholic thinkers. And this was, as a result of all this, you had Father John Courtney Murray, S.J., who writes in books like We Hold These Truths that the American expedient is better than the church's traditional aspiration toward the Catholic state. He will go on to become the major author of the two relevant documents in Vatican II. So, in a way, this is high noon for the Catholic Church in America. It's high noon for America. We straddle the earth. We make the Soviets back down over Cuba. We're doing well. And it all begins to unravel. We already in the 50s, the civil rights movement had begun to get underway. It got really, Eisenhower was in favor of it, because again, if you're going to say that you're the the defender of liberty across the planet, how can you tolerate something like Jim Crow? So a lot of the official federal backing of the civil rights movement came literally out of foreign issues, foreign policy. Because the Soviets, as you can imagine, and there were a lot of communists involved in civil rights and the opposition to Jim Crow. Some, definitely out of real conviction. Others otherwise. My parents got involved in civil rights, to be honest with you, not because of anything in the South, not at all. My dad was in a racially mixed play in New York after the war. And I don't know what the audience were, but the cast were racially mixed. And if you've ever been in a theatrical cast that has a relatively long run, you become pretty close, You may never see them again after the show's over, but during its run, it's almost like a family.
Yeah.
So one night after the show, the bunch of them went into the Waldorf Astoria. They were going to go to the bar. And they were told the black members couldn't be seated at the bar. They could only be seated in the lobby, and they could be served there. Well, my dad's thinking on the matter had already been, for a long time, going in that direction. But that crystallized it. And as he used to say, I wasn't turned against segregation in the awful old South. I was turned against segregation in advanced New York City. So again, people don't remember this stuff. But there were communists around at that time. And my dad, if there was anything he hated more than segregation, it was communism. So Dr. King had been to the Highlander Folk School. The Highlander Folk School had communists running it. And that was the end of my dad's interest in civil rights from about, 58, 59, when Dr. King became big. So he cleared out. But at any rate, that's my my personal connection, if you will, for the struggle. Although they had a number of friends from that era, and one of them, I can't remember his name for the life of me, but I remember something he used to say at the dinner table. I've never forgotten it, and I'm happy to pass it on. He would say, "If you do what you did, then you'll get what you got." And that, although it's funny the way he put it, there's a real truth there. If you do what you did, then you're going to get what you got. If you don't like what you have, change your methods. If you don't want to change your methods, then don't complain about what you have. Keep doing the same thing and expecting something different is the definition of madness. So at any rate, the civil rights movement gets underway in the late 50s in a big way. Although again, the shared experience of wartime, both in World War II and Korea, also did a number on it. And President Truman abolished segregation in the armed forces, so which had been the case up until then. So you then have and the Supreme Court begins its attacks on religion in public schools in the 50s. So you have then the civil rights issue. Kennedy gets assassinated. And at the same time, you have the whole Cold War continuance for a while. And now here comes the big issue. In 64, of course, Kennedy's dead. He's replaced by LBJ, who was a much more successful president than JFK was, although probably a much worse man. Not that Kennedy was a saint by any stretch, but LBJ was pawn scum. I mean that in a nice way. Anyhow, what should happen but that the election of 64, Barry Goldwater is savaged by the Democrats in a way that, we're used to now. But it's interesting that when Kennedy and Nixon ran against each other, they could say something that was true then. They said in each of their debates, we differ on means, not on ends. The election of 64 blew that out of the water. And my father's little joke, he was a big Goldwater fan. And his little joke was that, they told me that if I voted for Goldwater, I'd get a war in Southeast Asia. I voted for Goldwater, and sure enough, I got a war in Southeast Asia. They were right. So the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, the shock of the Kennedy assassination, a number of other things were happening, all had a culmination in something called the counterculture, the hippie movement. Yeah.
Some good music, I guess. Yeah, that was the only thing, some good music, I'll admit, but maybe that's about as much as I'll admit about the counterculture, right?
Well, I gotta say, some of it was very colorful. We moved out in the mid-'60s to Hollywood, and I was a little boy, and I'm standing on the corner, Sunset. Gosh, I can't remember. Sunset and Kissill, just south of my house, the Crismo building. And up comes this hippie chick in this long calico dress. And she comes up to me and she says, "You're a beautiful little boy. And I want to give you something beautiful." All that's all I need to hear is began looking for a cop, right? But she reaches into her pocket. She pulls out this leather bag and she takes my hand, wraps it around. "You are a beautiful little boy and you should have something beautiful." And then she walks away. I didn't know what was in that thing. As far as I knew, it could be a scorpion. So I take it back home. My dad's already home. There's Dad, Mom, my brother, and myself. We were sitting around the table. I put it in front. I tell him what happened. And Dad, looks at it. He says, "Well, only one way to find out." He pulls the thongs apart, turns the bag over, empties it out. It was seashells, carefully and intricately painted, some of them with glitter. They were beautiful. They were lovely. And somebody, probably her, had spent hours creating this stuff. And when I think of the best side of the 60s, I think of her. Tolkien, points out in one of his letters that it wasn't all about, as he puts it, fainéants and filth and drugs. There was also a yearning for cavaliers, for an end to conformity, a longing for color. And of course, out of that, you got things like the Renaissance Fair and all that, all of which was quite nice. Unfortunately, the dark side of it destroyed that moral consensus that we had. And therein lies the tale, because that moral consensus, without it, the religion of America had nowhere to stand, had nothing to hold it together. And what we've seen since is the decline of American exceptionalism. Oh, one thing I can't forget this. The Supreme Court eventually, in order to explain, while it was attacking religion in public life, it had to come up with a way to spare things like the oaths in court, "In God We Trust" on the money, the Pledge of Allegiance. How do you get around when you said separation of church and state means that the state can in no way support any kind of religion at all? How do you get around that? Well, they came up with a doctrine. A doctrine, you can look this up. It is so funny, if you're a Catholic anyway, and or a person who believes that things should mean something. It's so funny. It's called ceremonial deism. What that means is that these things, through repetition, have lost all religious meaning, and so are permissible precisely because they don't mean anything at all.
This is actually, I just looked this up. I always just assumed that it was just considered like, oh, it's just the traditional thing. Like they never spent the time to try to justify it. This is actually insane.
What?
Who
do you think you are?
I did not know that they actually took the time to be like, hey, this is actually, this makes us look bad. If someone were to point it out, we need to make a legal justification.
Yeah.
This is incredible. Wow. I did not know they actually like took this abstract thing and made it. Wow.
Ain't reality great?
Yeah. This category of ceremonial deism most clearly encompasses such things as the national motto, religious references in traditional patriotic songs such as the Star Spangled Banner, and the words with which the marshal of this court opens each of its sessions. These references are not minor trespasses upon the Establishment Clause, to which I turn a blind eye. Instead, their history, character, and context prevent them from being constitutional violations at all. And that was from Justice O'Connor's concurring opinion in 2004.
Yeah,
So
isn't
that's the
that
most
lovely?
clear.
Yeah. Just sheer drivel, flowing sewage out of a mouth. I think it's lovely. Anyway, I digress. So all this is going on. I have to say that back in 2017, my brother and I jumped in the car and drove up from LA to the Bay Area to listen to Mort Saul, who's a comedian of our early childhood, who's still alive then. He was doing one night a week. And so we drove to Mill Valley to hear him. Well, Andre and I had never both been in San Francisco a number of times, and neither of us had been there together. So I took him to my favorite restaurant, John's Grill. And then we went, this is 2017, 50 years after the Summer of Love. So we had to pay our obeisance to the great moment of our generation. We went to the corner of Haight and Ashbury. Well, it was 11:30 at night. There was nobody there. But all the little shops had these tchotchkes commemorating the Summer of Love. And Andre looks and he goes, nobody knows how to cash in like these anti-capitalists, which I thought was funny. But we're standing there, and I whip out my trusty phone, and I start playing Scott McKenzie, singing, "If you're going to San Francisco, be sure to wear some flowers in your hair." And there we were, swinging to the hopes of an entire generation. Excuse me, I think you're lacking a certain reverence. Anyway, so there we were doing this, and this black guy comes dancing up the street, literally, to music of his own manufacture, but he's dancing, and not to our music. He comes dancing up, and he looks at us and says, "What are you guys doing?" And I looked at him and I said, "We're living the cliche." And he goes, "Yeah, F the dream, live the cliche." And he danced away. And after he was out of earshot, my brother looks at me and he says, "Well, it looks like we made a convert to something." So, at any rate, this was the era, is the age of Aquarius, all this stuff, when the moon is in the 7th house and Jupiter aligns with Mars, and on and on and on. The stuff was in the air. I just have to make a point about that, though. I'm sorry to do this to you, but it's one of these things. Wikipedia is an endless source of help. If you go to the Wikipedia article for Age of Aquarius, which of course was the name of that song, I'm sorry, I got to share this. They talk about, if you look up Age of Aquarius, you go down to pop culture. It says, the musical here with its opening song, Aquarius, features line, "This is the dawning of the age of Aquarius," in the chorus, brought the Aquarian age concept to the attention of audiences worldwide. The song further defines this dawning of the age within the first lines: "When the moon is in the 7th house and Jupiter aligns with Mars, then peace will guide the planets and love will steer the stars." Well, astrologer Neil Spencer, whoever he is, denounced the lyrics as "quote unquote" astrological gibberish, noting that Jupiter aligns with Mars several times a year And the moon is in the 7th house for 2 hours every day.
Well, as Don McLean put it in American Pie, a whole generation lost in space. Right. So
and we have yet to come back to Earth.
yeah.
Major Tom to ground control. No, I'm afraid we're still lost in space. The problem is we've taken the rest of you with us.
Yeah, well, the problem is they got lost in space, and they somehow ended up in Congress. And
we took you along. We brought
Yeah.
you along on the journey. And remember, it's not about the destination; it's about the journey.
I don't know. I don't know about you, Mr. Coulombe, but I think I want off this ride. I don't know. I don't know about the destination anymore.
Well, neither do we.
Yeah.
We don't know where we're going, and why should we? Mom and Dad were always about destinations and being responsible, but we showed them. Well, at any rate, we want eventually, and now we'll encapsulate it and bring ourselves to the glorious present. Generation lost in space. I'm sorry, Don McLean, rather. That, in my humble opinion, was the greatest poem written in the United States in the last 50 years of the 20th century.
It's amazing. I love American Pie is such a great song because it encapsulates kind of that. I mean, it's almost, I imagine if you would consider the Second Republic being from, the Civil War up until the eve of World War II, the Third Republic really being that, coming off of that wartime high, entering into this, this counterculture period that starts off so optimistic, but then kind of going into the dark ages of the 70s, right? And obviously that being encapsulated in music. Obviously, Mr. McLean uses The Day the Music Died, that horrible event where, in that plane crash, you lose some of these really big names that were the standards of like the early 60s. And that cultural shift, kind of culminating with the Rolling Stones concert, where someone literally getting killed. That crescendo, that's the star exploding, the supernova, which is beautiful to look at, but it's also the death of the star.
Yeah.
Right. Like,
and you're absolutely right. And I firmly believe, because all through it, believe it or not, I've taught a course on this very subject. I call it The Ethics of Despair, analyzing American Pie. But at the last verse, I've always felt, has an oblique reference to Catholicism after Vatican II.
Yes.
I went down to the sacred store, and this, by the way, has been the example of a lot of quote-unquote reverts who, they left the church at that time. They come back 5, 10, 15 years later, and it's not the church they left. And they don't understand that. They don't get that. So I went down to the sacred store where I heard the music years before, but the men there said the music wouldn't play. Well, what's no Gregorian chant for you, my lad? And in the streets, the children screamed, the poets, lovers wept, and the poets streamed. Not a word was spoken. The church bells all were broken. And the three men I admire most, the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost, they caught the last train for the coast the day the music died. So it goes on to be bigger than just Buddy Holly and Altamont, but the entire experience of a generation that my older brothers, really, that went nowhere and did nothing except that they were in charge. And that's kind of where we are. And a lot of them, of course, lost faith in the American religion. And this is where it gets interesting. You remember I mentioned the Congregationalism had been the established faith in colonial New England, and it remained so for many years after the Constitution in New Hampshire and Massachusetts and Connecticut. But at the same time, you had the Unitarian movement, which was sort of an utter inversion of Calvinism. Unitarianism was just flipped it. Well, wokery, as we know it, I believe, is to American exceptionalism, to the old religion of America, as Unitarianism is to Calvinism. It takes the same basic premises and flips them. So instead of the United States being the last best hope of mankind, the shining city on the hill, it's the most horrible country that ever was, born in genocide and built on slavery. And the reality, of course, is that neither of those two approaches are true. The reality is that the United States of America are a country that is like any other. It has its origins, which, are more or less dodgy, but that's how we got here. And it isn't 1776. It's 1567 or 1607 or maybe even 1492. Because we're really not, our colonial origins are all bound up with those of Canada and Mexico. So it's always a little distorted to try to look at it separately. And certainly in the beginning. Then, we've come along, and we are a country who've done some great things, we've done some horrible things. Kind of like, I don't know, every other country. There is kind of a weird dichotomy between the country as it is and its leadership, and that's always been the case. I tell people over here, if you want to love my country, come to the United States, get in a car, and take a road trip. Anywhere you want. The longer the better. San Diego to St. Louis, St. Paul to Boston, Baltimore to New Orleans. Anywhere you want to go, doesn't matter. You will be convinced that this is the most wonderful country on earth with the most incredible people. If you want to hate my country and think it's the major instrument of Satan, study the history of our foreign policy. And that's the weird dichotomy that we are. And it's a big part of our identity. It's a big part of our nature, So I say all this, you're bringing it now to the present, and then I guess we perhaps will have questions from the audience now that all this time has gone by, but I don't mind. You got the time, I got the time.
This has just been incredible, every moment of it. So continue, please.
All right. Well, the thing is that now we have come to a spot, and mind you, I don't want to beat up entirely on my generation, although it's easy and fun, and also we're old and slow, so we're easier to catch than people your age. But but the fact is that that the America that I was born into, that I remember from my childhood, is the America of the Knights of Columbus and the American Legion and the Elks and the Boy Scouts. I'm very proud I was an Eagle Scout.
Same.
Yeah, means a lot to me. It meant a lot to me to have served in the National Guard. It meant a lot to me to have gone to New Mexico Military Institute. And when I was a cadet, because of the great Soviet menace, we all thought we'd be dead before age 30. We'd never thought, not in a million years, when I was your age, did I think I'd live to be 65. Nor could I have imagined the Soviet Union falling peacefully. There's no way I could have seen it, but I couldn't have seen queer marriage. I had already seen abortion, but I couldn't imagine it becoming sacramentalized, or euthanasia. I mean, like this poor Spanish girl, she's raped by 2 immigrants. She, for some reason, has some kind of mental upset. I don't know where that came from. And the same government that basically set her up for a fall euthanizes her. Maybe it's the cabinet of Spain that should share her experience to find out what it's like from the first hand. And you see, this is what has come to infuriate me so much, is the sheer hypocrisy of everything, of those in charge. In race, their way of dealing with racial imbalances, which are the product of cultural and historical influences, is to keep them trapped on the old plantation as infants. And they don't do much better with the whites, I'll tell you. The dumbing down of education I've watched my entire life. Nobody knows nothing about nothing. And that includes the people on top. because they become victims of their own dynamic, you see. The thing that has to be understood, I think, about our leadership today, for the most part, and in most countries, I'm sure there are exceptions if you look hard enough, but there are three qualities that characterize them. They're evil, they're insane, and they're stupid. Now, okay, what do I mean by that? I want to qualify, because I'm not just throwing around insults. I'm not really. What is it to be evil? To be evil is to be totally dedicated purely to oneself, like Satan. To have no regard for anyone else and to want only power. No concept of the common good, no deference to anyone else. It's all about me. And mind you, all of us share these qualities. The question is, A, whether we're conscious of it, and B, whether we try to fight it. Because all three of these qualities, I've pointed out, are the birthright of fallen man. The person who attempts to be good, who tries to be noble, who tries to rise above it, really does have to do damage to self. You'll never see this better illustrated than with babies. You know, as soon as they're able to exert any kind of pressure, because they're human beings, it's all about me. And there is a kind of infantilism to the truly evil. They have no love, no affection for anything other than themselves, and even that's kind of hollow. The second, they're insane. Now, insane, I don't mean they think they're Napoleon or Josephine. Rather, when the leadership are insane, the visions that dance in their little pointed heads are more real to them, not just the well-being of their servants, which doesn't mean anything to them anyway, but their own. So, for instance, our National Socialist friends were more interested in imposing their racial theories on the Eastern Front than they were in defeating the Soviet Union. And so they lost. Our current leadership are more interested in getting women into combat than in winning battles. That's insane. It's madness. It's not going to do them any good. You know, if I say that we need to lower the SEALs' physical requirements so that women can participate, excuse me? Excuse me? What do you think the SEALs are about? You know, it isn't some club like the Freemasons, who, by the way, don't admit women, but that's another story. Anyway, I had to get that in there, didn't we? Nice. Can we stick to the topic and not just throw in off-the-cuff insults?
People have to remember, you know, this is a Catholic show, so we have to make some reference to our immortal enemy.
The Freemasons, yes, of course. Yes. And let's and the Illuminati. Don't forget them.
Yeah.
Or the real world rivals, the Inebriati, who really run the world.
Yeah.
But you never heard of the Inebriati?
The Irish?
No, the secret society. No, they run the world secretly from behind their bottles and looking up for their wine cellars. The Inebriati. Look them up. Mitchell and Webb, the Inebriati. So anyway, gotta see them. So what should happen then, as I say, is you've got the second quality, but then the third is the third. And the third, in a way, is the worst. Because, you know, when people are evil, if you can figure out what they think is their self-interest, then you can deal with them to a degree. I mean, to some, or you can at least predict them. If they're insane, that's harder. But if you can figure out what their mania is, then you can do something with that. But the third quality, stupidity, nothing to be done with that. Because stupidity is something very specific. It's the marriage of ignorance and arrogance. That's very important to understand. An ignorant person is not by any means necessarily stupid. But you add arrogance to ignorance, and he can't learn anything because he doesn't need to. He already knows. Well, if you're so smart, how come you're not the master like me, huh? Yeah, I bet you couldn't answer that one, could you? No, you're right. I couldn't, thank God. So stupidity is really, that is the hallmark, not just of leadership, but of all of us today. Stupiditas omnia vincit. Because, you see, and this goes back to human qualities, all of us have to struggle against being evil, insane, and stupid. It's true. But in every human society, the rulers reflect the ruled, and the ruled reflect the rulers, regardless of the structure, regardless of whether there's a constitution or not, regardless of whether the top dog is elected or hereditary or military or whatever. It's just the way these things work. So you can tell an era, I mean, look at our artwork. Look at what we produce. It's crap, most of it. Not all of it, because the essential human spirit can never be destroyed completely. You see, that's the funny thing. We have this dichotomy. So often we do stupid, horrible, evil, stupid, insane things. But sometimes we don't. Sometimes we do good things, and sometimes really great ones. Very often, I would say, when you look at the totality of the world's leadership down through the centuries, you've had a few really great ones. You've had a very few really evil ones. You have a lot of mediocre ones, kind of like, I don't know, people in general. But we happen to live in a period, in a time, a period, and a place where the leadership are corrupt and evil, where they're all for infanticide, they're all for IVF, they're all for gay marriage. And we're supposed to get excited about the differences between them. But in a sense, and how conscious or not this is, that's a whole other story, and I couldn't tell you because I don't know. What I do know is that nothing stays the same, and it would be good if there was some sort of resistance and eventually successful resistance to what's going on. It would be wonderful if the opposition had brains, and if the next chapter was more consciously written by smarter people. But the next chapter will be written, one way or the other. This whole thing could collapse around our ears, and we might have to start rebuilding from rocks. And of course, I wouldn't be around to see it. Sorry, kids. Our little gift. But what is certain is that we'll come through this. But against this historical background, the other thing that has to be borne in mind is that you and me and everybody around us are also working out our individual salvations. Never, ever, ever lose sight of that. That is the most important thing in your life, in my life, in the lives of our loved ones, in the lives of our friends, and going outward. Our masters, either in church or state, may not care about our salvation, but we have to. And in a weird way, we have to care about theirs too. The stupider the master, the more we have to pray for him. Because he doesn't know what he's been off. He doesn't know what he's chewing. Do you think any of these Epstein's Islands people were really keen on going to hell?
It's hard to say.
I mean, even Satanists think they can somehow escape the deal somehow. And believe me, I've known a couple of them. They either pretend not to believe in Satan or somehow think they can cheat him. That's a very stupid stance to take, but what did I say about stupidity? And as my late father used to say, all of us are stupid most of the time. Most of us are stupid all the time. And I said, "That's not very comforting, Dad." And he goes, "Well, it's true, and truth should be comforting, shouldn't it?" Anyhow, having brought my long, endless dialogue, I've brought us to the present day. And all I can say, speaking as a boomer, and let me say it for you, okay, boomer. There, it's been said. Well, it was the elephant in the room. We had to get it out of the way.
You're one of the good ones. It's fine.
I know the 12 of us have lunch every other Wednesday, but no, it's actually one thing that's important to remember is that, like everything else, it's a mixed bag. I mean, today, amongst my older brothers, and I don't mean I've only got the one brother, and he's still, thank God, very much with us. And he was a brigadier general in the Guard, and a real straight arrow. But a lot of my friends amongst my older brother's age, the ones I'm the friendliest with, other than the hyper Catholics, are the still clinging to the countercultural types. Well, there's a reason for that. There's a difference between Berkeley on the one hand and Haight-Ashbury on the other. I mean, Haight-Ashbury was a mess of drugs and free love, etc. But they were looking for something different, even as Tolkien said. There was something there. It never went anywhere. And if anything, it was used for the purpose of the other side. And the other side was the political, the SDS, Berkeley, and so on. There was a documentary which I recommend highly. If you want to get a feeling of what boomer narcissism could be like, it's called Berkeley in the '60s. Have a look. My late lamented friend Jim Thomas saw it, and he says the left takes a good, long, hard look at itself and likes what it sees. So, honestly, you really can't make this garbage up. So, but I have to say, I'm still willing to sing if you're going to San Francisco. I appreciate the insight that created American Pie.
Mm-hmm.
I still love the TV of that era. Some of the music, most of the '70s music, my gosh, I can't stand. And who plays the Commodores anymore? Who plays Casey and the Sunshine Band? Nobody.
Yeah, disco was an interesting experiment.
Oh, yeah. Well, Disco Inferno.
Yeah.
Gosh, what a load of garbage. But I'm, and now it's 2025.
No, 2026, sir.
Sorry, 2026. Thank you. See, slowing down. I'm 65, and it's 2026. And I look back at all those years I've seen, and it's hard to say, wow, what was that all about?
It was the latter half of the 20th century. It's just, I mean, growing up through that, like many of your, like your generation did, my father included, my father's actually very close in age to you. And it wouldn't surprise me if, because he was also living in that area of California, that y'all might not have known it, but y'all might have crossed paths somehow. Y'all around the same age. It's actually wild to think about. Yeah. And, from the amount of change, everyone talks about this in terms of like industrial society. Obviously, the amount of change someone born in 1900 would have seen in their lifetime. I mean, just like living through from, the post-war era, the post-World War II era to now. I mean, just from 1960 to 2000 alone. incredible.
It really has been. And you know, one of my pet phrases is that the America that I was born in is deader than Austria-Hungary, and it is. The pieces are everywhere, but that's true of Austria-Hungary.
Mhm.
You know. Now my grandfather was born in 1890, and he died in 1987.
Wow.
So he was a World War I vet, and you know he had seen amazing amounts of change. And yet, as he told me, the strange thing, last time I saw him was in 86, the year before he died. He said, the funny thing, you know, is that I don't feel really different. You know, I'm the same man that lived through all of that, and here I am, and, you know, nothing works, and my body's failing me, but I'm still me. And that really is how I feel. And of course, I'm at the time of life where my friends are dying right, left, and center. I told you before the show. I told you a funny story about a friend of mine from high school. He died last September, and you know, you look back, and certainly for me, I can't speak for anyone else really, but you want to leave behind the best you can. You want to give you guys weapons, tools to fight in a battlefield that I can't imagine. And I know, looking back at my own father and my mentors, whom I was blessed with an inordinate number, they were doing the same thing. They didn't know what I'd be facing now. They couldn't. I don't know what they would have done with this world. But oddly enough, growing up in Hollywood in the 60s and 70s and being exposed to all the weirdness I was exposed to was the best possible training for this garbage. Because I can laugh at it. I can point at it in a way that I probably couldn't if I'd been born in a saner place or time. I mean, my gosh, could you imagine being born in 1960 in Topeka, Kansas, and living there your whole life? Land of Goshen, land sakes. I don't know what I've been doing then, but I mean, you know, you when you had the age of Aquarius on every corner, as we did, I look at this garbage now and say, you're not even good at it.
Well, that's the interesting dichotomy, right? And like this is like what you sometimes see with children that grow up in very sheltered environments is the moment they go out into that world for the first time, it's overwhelming and they just completely fall apart.
Yeah.
But then there's also the dichotomy is, you know, a kid growing up in an environment where there is already a lot of chaos. You know, there's always that risk they could just fall victim to it. But if they don't, the individual that comes out of that is an operator that can move like almost like amphibious, can move between those spheres, and knows the enemy in a way that many don't.
Precisely right.
I think the internet has been but like for my generation, growing up with the internet, having, for better for worse, access to the best and worst parts of humanity at a moment's notice, like that, right? And also growing up with all the weird changes that we experience, maybe not to the extent of the groundbreaking nature, although who's to say in 30 years what the history books will say.
Yeah.
But what, like, to put it bluntly, like when I was in high school, you know, by the time I got out as a senior, our school, which is in rural Virginia, had a individual who wanted to change all the bathrooms because it didn't fit their gender identity, so to speak. I made Eagle Scout, and then the next year the Boy Scouts allowed women in. And then, you know, all throughout the state in 2020, I believe, all the monuments in Monument Avenue in Richmond were torn down one day.
Yeah.
And I have one anecdote I do want to share as part of, if we're wrapping up, we don't have to, but one anecdote I had from that time. So that was June 10th, 2020. They tore those statues down. So they had all these statues of Jeb Stuart, Jackson, Jefferson Davis, there's a really big one to him. But because going back to what we were talking about with the national reunification, there also is a statue to what's that gentleman's name? He was a black tennis player.
Arthur Ashe.
Arthur Ashe. Yeah, there's an Arthur Ashe Boulevard and statue on Monument Avenue, sharing the same, beautiful venue of Monument Avenue, right? It's a really nice part of Richmond. You can walk it. It's really beautiful. So I'm there with my good friends, and we had actually just attended a high mass at the fraternity parish in Richmond, and we go out for lunch near Monument Avenue, and we're all dressed up coming from church, and we eat our lunch and say, well, let's go see what happened. So we walk over, and of course they've defaced all the monuments. The ones they couldn't screw up, they just spray painted all sorts of nasty, vulgar language on. And eventually we go over to the Davis Memorial, the president of the former CSA. And his is a pretty interesting one. It's really big. And we're over there, we're watching, just, there's people milling about still. There's kind of that after event energy where everyone's just kind of, there's like a deflation of the tension, so to speak. And there's two other young men there around the same age as us, maybe like the inverse of me and my friend. And, the VCU type, I would put it mildly, right? Like that's kind of the vibe they gave off. And it was one black guy, one white guy, and they're looking at the statue of Jefferson Davis, and they're talking to one another. And the black one asked the white one, "Who is that?" And the white guy, to his credit, he gave a guess. He said, I think that was some president. Okay, so technically right so far. I think that's Andrew Jackson.
So
I did walk over. Yeah,
you had Tweedledum and Tweedledummer.
Yeah, I did walk over to him and said, no, Andrew Jackson is the gentleman on the $20 bill who is also a U.S. president. That's Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederacy. And that was news to them. So,
well, see, again, you've got 3 generations raised morons. They don't know anything, and they get stirred up over what? And then there are 2 ways you can relate to that. You get this. I don't know what they teach them, but it isn't anything in school, and you can either accept it and end up like your friends there, and be totally brain dead, or you can say, no, that's wrong. You can rebel against it, but you'll probably do so in the stupidest way possible. You'll just transfix everything they said. So they said Hitler was good, he must have been bad. Or vice versa. I don't know what kind of school he would have gone to where they said he was good. If they said Hitler was bad, you simply transverse it, he was good. Well, what's lost, you mentioned nuance earlier. Even nuance requires actual fact. before you can even get to nuance, you got to have some fact. When all you've got is this shifting sea of nothing in particular, that's very hard. And so, your generation often upset. Mine was saying awful things and nasty comments and being insensitive and stuff. And I'll admit, sometimes it gets to me too. I don't mind saying. But how did that happen? Who made you guys this way? Where did that come from? You weren't dropped by the stork. So who did that? Let me see. Who dominated education and media and government? Okay, it wasn't you guys because you were too little. Who could it have been? I don't know. It's a mystery to me. But somehow what you were given was beyond substandard. Now, much as I hate playing the blame game, I always think of Jerry Adams, the Sinn Féin guy in Northern Ireland. Well, we can all play the blame game. There's nobody at this table who doesn't have blood on his hands. God, what a thing to say, Mr. Adams. But anyway, the point is that in dealing with younger people, I do believe that we have to show a lot more patience because, to a great degree, we created the problem. So, when people go after Nick Fuentes for saying some really bizarre and off-the-wall things, well, yeah, but who's going to tell him different? I mean, who did he respect who would tell him different?
Yeah, that's true.
And often enough, the answer is nobody. There was no one, no one to tell him the truth. I don't just mean him in particular. I mean, that generation. And because we try to avoid nuance, the truth is generally a little bit more intricate than we like. We like simple. We don't like intricate, but intricate is the truth. So always beware of the easy, simple explanation because it's usually wrong. Not always, but usually. I feel worse than I can tell you for your generation and the one preceding it, because you were handed a plate of crap, and some of you ate it up and some of you don't like it and throw the plate back. And then we get upset when the plate gets thrown at us. What's wrong with you? Why aren't you grateful? Gee, I don't know. Plate full of crap wasn't my idea of breakfast. So these are the sorts of things you've got to deal with. I can only say, and I can only hope that you all do a better job than we did. You've got to go back to your first principles. You've got to rediscover a lot of things that we've either obscured or didn't know ourselves. I mean, one of the things you got to bear in mind too is that we didn't jump out of a duffel bag. Mm. I asked my father. Now, mind you, Dad was a tail gunner in the Second War against the Japanese. And he was an actor and a lot of other things apart from being a civil rights advocate. But I asked him what he thought the worst thing was that had ever happened to the United States in his time. And I thought he would say the 60s. I was sure of it. No. He said World War II. I said, what? We won World War II, Dad. Which, of course, he was in it, so I would think he would know. And his response was, he looked at me wearily and he said, son, you win a war the way you win an earthquake. The damage that war did to this country has never been repaired. The damage it did to the relationship between the sexes. You had a whole generation who for 5 years didn't have their fathers. He said it's never gotten back on track since. The divorces that came out of that war, it was horrific. And that was only the United States. We were the winners.
Yeah.
All the losers, and that means every other country that fought in that war. Britain, Germany, France, the Soviet Union, all the other countries that lost, they did worse than we did. And the damage was greater. So, I mean, that's one of the differences between us boomers in the States and the so-called generation of 65 here, or 68 rather, who run the show here. The generation of 68, they're the same age group that we are. But the difference is that we grew up in abundance. We were pampered.
Mm-hmm.
These guys started their first years running through the ruins of World War II. And of course, with us, if we said, what did you do in the war, Daddy? The answer would range from heroic to at least credible. Here, what did you do in the war, Daddy? Became a club you could use to beat the guilt out of the older generation with. So it's a somewhat different dynamic. And then, of course, there's also the fact that after 1945, there was no real leadership here anyway. The Americans and the Soviets made the real decisions. So and all of this stuff came together to produce us, and we produced you. And, the general tenor has been downhill in terms of morals and intelligence and everything else. And here in Europe right now, we're going through the pains of the so-called Great Replacement. Massive immigration from the Near East and Africa and elsewhere, and the leadership both facilitating that and penalizing anyone who notices there's a problem. Again, I think of that poor girl in Spain today. But I mean, this stuff is happening constantly. What is the tipping point? And who's going to tip it? The leadership? The Muslims? The outraged locals? If they can pull themselves together? I don't know. I have no idea. Mutatis mutandis, in the United States, you have two countries living cheek by jowl with each other. And although they occupy the same national space, they live on different planets. What's going to come out of that? I don't know. But here's something to bear in mind. You, me, and everybody watching this program right now descend from people who lived through the Black Plague. They saw 3/4 of the neighborhood die in front of them. And yet, they came through, and they rebuilt, and they had children. And we know they had children because you and I are looking at each other. Obviously, if they hadn't, we wouldn't be here. So, remember that however daunting the challenges, one, there's the question of your personal salvation, and two, somehow or other, somebody's going to get through all this. Those are the two bottom lines. We have not here an abiding city. We're going to die and leave it. We hope for a greater eternity, which is the end of everybody at last. And secondly, for as long as this world goes on, somebody, somehow will always manage to get through and survive. So don't be downhearted. Depending on when the last days are, the best may yet to be. The greatest may be ahead of us. We don't know. We're not given to know. So, you've got to be realistic in what you do. Be hopeful. Be hopeful, because this is not all there is. There's the future in this world, and there's eternity in the next. So, if there's any message I can leave you with, it's that if you do your very best, then you'll save your soul, and you'll leave something worthwhile behind, so long as there's a behind to see. And one day that will end. The dead will come up from their graves. The general judgment will be held. And then we'll all get to know each other properly.
Exactly. Sir, thank you so much for coming on the show. This went way over time than I originally planned. Again, it's very late for you. Oh, well, it's very late for you over in Europe. So my whole thinking is like, oh my goodness, I don't want to, take up all of Mr. Coulombe's time, but this conversation went by so quickly, and we covered so much more than the initial topic. My original idea for a title was going to be, episode 19, a song of blue and gray. But now I think that
Song of Fire and Ice.
yeah, that was the idea, right? I wanted to kind of do something like that. But now I'm thinking, there was that one individual who wrote that book, Mr. Howard Zinn. He wrote A People's History of the United States. Yeah. Well, I'm thinking Charles Coulombe's Catholic's History of the United States. And maybe even the Western world, because this is what this almost 3-hour conversation really encapsulated. And thank you for it, because I think that hopefully a lot of people watch this, and obviously also check you out on Pelican as well, because I know that you have so much work that you're planning on doing as well over there.
Check me out on Pelican, on Tumblr House, where I've got all of the off the menus and the things I did with Bill Biersack, and Catholicism.org, Crisis, 1 Peter 5, the European Conservative. You can see my stuff scattered all about. But before we adjourn, it is 12:06. It's after midnight here. But before we adjourn, why don't you go ahead and throw the questions at me if you have any?
Okay, sure. So I did ask some of my followers if they had any questions for Mr. Coulombe, and I was like, hey, just be respectful. So I have some good ones here. So first one, are you a consumer of beet kvass? That is one they asked. Beet kvass, as in like kvass, the rye bread drink.
Well, I'm going to be very honest with you. I have no idea what it is, so I can't tell you. But let's look it up. What I was thinking was beetle nuts, but they couldn't have meant that.
So I can actually tell you from my experience, my limited experience in Europe, as you know, I went to Lithuania, and kvass it's fermented rye bread. So it's a very dark, like usually very slightly alcoholic, like almost like a soda. And in the former Soviet states, when they couldn't have Coke, that was the closest thing you could get was kvass.
The answer is no.
Okay. Good to know. Someone did ask, what is your favorite devotion besides the rosary?
Glad you asked that. I love the rosary, but I love, well, this gets a little complicated. I love the Sacred Heart and the Precious Blood. But of course, they're all connected with each other, with the Blessed Sacrament, with the Holy Grail, and dare I say it, with the Kingship of Christ and the Queenship of Mary, because the Sacred and Immaculate Hearts are tied together. And the thing is, for me, these all sort of flow into each other, if you see what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say that definitely the Sacred Heart of the Precious Blood, the Kingship of Christ, the Queenship of Mary, the Immaculate Heart of Mary, these are all very, very, very important to me. And Blessed Karl, of course, of Austria, Blessed Charlemagne, my namesake, and St. George, St. Michael.
Gotta have them everywhere. There we go. Hey, twinning. That's great.
So, St. Michael, the Archangel, St. George, there are a lot of St. Nicholas I'm very fond of. St. Bridget of Ireland. She helped me out of a jam once, and I've never forgotten her. I mean, forget it. Yeah, I like St. Patrick very much, and not just because of the drinking. St. Joan of Arc. There are a lot of them, and of course, I go through periods of being more attentive to one than the other, but they've all helped me out one way or another. Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception, I'm very fond of, simply because she's the patroness of the United States. I got the chance to drop by the National Shrine again the week before last. I was in D.C. and it's a funny thing. I went to both the National Shrine and the National Cathedral, the Episcopal National Cathedral, and I just wrote a piece for Pelican actually about the difference between the two. The National Shrine is a weird hodgepodge of styles. I mean, it's the most bizarre thing. Byzantine Romanesque with a bit of Gothic to start.
Mm-hmm.
And then the interior is just a total hodgepodge. But, it really works in a strange way. It reminds me of nothing so much as an ordinary church in England, St. Agatha's in Portsmouth, England, which likewise, it's a Romanesque church, but it's got all kinds of side altars and stuff that have come from other places, and it's like an ecclesiastical rummage sale. But it works. I mean, it's very much a place of prayer, and it feels like it. The National Cathedral is a beautiful Gothic building. It's gorgeous, and the high altar and the lady altar are very beautiful, but feels like a museum. Very, very cold, very dead. Woodrow Wilson's tomb is there. And I like to say that I've been to Blessed Karl's tomb. I've been to Servant of God Zita's tomb. I've been to Woodrow Wilson's tomb. I've only prayed by two of them.
Yeah. Yeah, it's unfortunate with, the 14 points and everything, and that
Well,
wind up.
I did cross myself once by his tomb, and one of the clerics asked me if I was praying, and I said no, it was for protection.
Yep. Praying for praying for his soul too. I hope, it's sad that the last Virginian had to be Wilson in the
Well,
presidency.
always remember those two magic words, so far.
So far. It could
You
always
never
be worse.
say
It's true.
you never say the last emperor, the last king. You say the last emperor so far. The last king of France, the last king of Spain, the last king of Portugal so far. Those two magic words turn a dirge to hope. But what else you got?
Last one, and this kind of ties into the previous episode. I had a representative of the Monarchists of America come on the show, and it is tied to that. This person asked, what practical path forward under monarchism in the U.S. exists, especially a notion of a Catholic monarchy? Obviously, that could be a very long answer, so that's up to you, however much you want to answer that or not.
Well, I'll tell you, I wrote a book which Tumblr House brought out called Star Spangled Crown. And that was sort of an exploration. In Star Spangled Crown, I basically was exploring a couple of themes. One of them was, has been pointed out to me, that there's not really a Catholic monarchism. There are Catholic monarchisms, plural, because of the different countries. So I was concerned with what these different Catholic monarchisms had in common. And what better way to look at the commonalities than against a basically created from scratch monarchy, the American. But at the same time, I had to somehow link it up to the American past because monarchy depends on that kind of tradition. And I think I did, my mythical king did as good a job as anyone could in doing that. And I also talked a bit about what's called the invention of tradition, how very often things that we think are age old are actually pretty recent, were done for a particular purpose, but they kind of get absorbed. And traditions like that can never be completely artificial. They have to be based on something real. The example that I used, so the thing is, in the book, the king is a descendant of the Stuarts. But he's also a descendant of the French and Spanish Bourbons, and he's sort of a fictionalized version of the Prince of Liechtenstein. Because not the current one, not his son, but his grandson, Joseph Wenzel, will be the heir to the Stuart claims, and also a descendant of the French and Spanish Bourbons. So, and he fits, given his extreme youth, he fits sort of my mythical timeline for when this might occur, which would be basically the middle of the next century. So, but I'm never clear on dates. It starts out saying that the election of 2016 went as badly as everyone feared, and I never say who won. And the Republican, I don't. Again, I'm not. I appear in the book as a very old man, so I'm in my 90s. So it's roughly 30 years from now that the monarchy comes in, and then my great nephew is writing the book, and he's in his 90s. He was a boy when it started. So we're talking the time period when he's writing, and again, he's looking back over the 80 years of the American monarchy's existence, from the time of his boyhood until his present. So, it's about 180 years from now,
Wow.
more or less. But it's as I say, I was purposely vague about a lot of things. At any rate, so the thing, one of the other themes is an American patriotism that's based upon our actual foundations and the reality of the country as it is, as opposed to the ideal of America, which now in the real world, and definitely by the time of the instauration, as I call it in the book, it's totally gone. And the new king has to somehow pick up the tattered fragments of American identity and merge them with his new monarchy. Now, mind you, that kind of thing has been done before. The Meiji Restoration in Japan, for instance, and the creation of the American national religion itself from whole cloth. Again, it was sort of whole cloth, but I mean, they did take things that were real. They just sort of, did them. And one of the examples I give in the book is how, and when I say I now and me, I'm talking about my non-existent great nephew who allegedly writes the book. And he says that just as in my childhood, editorial writers and people like that would talk about how our fathers stood against the British at Lexington and Concord. Whereas, of course, in reality, the vast majority of Americans do not descend from people who fought at Lexington and Concord. They just don't. But we nevertheless talk about them as our forebears. So today, bearing in mind it's his today, in this 180 years from now, so today the same sort of people will talk about how our fathers stood with his at Culloden. Well, of course, and our writer says, of course, that's the one is no more is literally true than the other, but it is true in a real sense, in a more psychological sense. It is true. So there's a scene in the book, and I made it a point of not making my mythical king too perfect. So he makes some decisions that may or may not have been smart. But basically, he decides once the monarchy is definitely in place that the United States have a debt of honor toward Liberia and the Philippines. And so it's our obligation to bring them back into the Union and basically settle their problems. Well, as you can imagine, that immediately leads to a couple of wars.
Yeah.
In the course of which the youngest prince is killed at the same time that the narrator's cousin is killed. His favorite cousin. Favorite cousin dies fighting in the Philippines. Prince Henry dies fighting in Liberia. And our narrator at the time, again, he's a young man at the point, at this time in the book. He's got a job, a military job in Washington. And he's present when the body of the prince is brought to the White House, and the king and the royal family are out on the terrace and all that. Well, by this time, the Jacobite mythology has become wedded to the American myth, and the various Jacobite songs are all part of our patriotic songbook, alongside the old ones. They never get rid of them. They still sing "America the Beautiful" and all this, alongside "Will You Don't Come Back Again." So.
Wow.
So they're bringing the body in, and the crowd begins singing "It Was All for Our Rightful King," which is a Burns song. And mind you, in the real world, scenes like this have happened God knows how many times. That the body of a younger heir, member of the royal family, dies fighting in a war. He's brought home. It was like that. In England when the Duke of Kent was killed during World War II. And they brought his body back. And of course, his brother is the king. But everybody in the crowd had lost someone in the war. And now the royal family had lost one. And the shared moment was incredible. And mind you, there have been scenes like that throughout history. So what I did was I put that into American terms. Our narrator's cousin has died in the Philippines. Young Prince Henry is brought back from Liberia. The crowd are all, at the fence of the White House. They're singing "'Twas All for Our Rightful King," and the king himself comes out on the terrace, and all he can say is, "My people, my very dear people." I'm writing this, and the tears are filling my eyes. I'm thinking, what the hell is wrong with me? None of this ever happened, but it's an archetype.
Mm-hmm.
It's the sort of thing that has happened innumerable times before. And in all likelihood, depending on how long the world lasts, will happen again. I was thinking of the time, one of the things was in my head when I was writing that was when Franz Ferdinand was murdered at Sarajevo. Karl and Zita were down in the Villa of Artholz here in Reichenau, which isn't too far from here. And Franz Josef was way out in the Salzkammergut at a place called Ischl, the Kaiservilla. So Karl and Zita got back to the capital before he did, because they're much closer. And then they were waiting for him at the Westbahnhof, the Western Station in Vienna. He comes back on the train, and the crowds are all there, and they're all kind of mournful. And they cheer him, but it's a very mournful cheering. And he gets into the car, and the three of them drive back to Schönbrunn. And they get out. The three of them are alone, and Franz Josef looks at the two of them and says, "First my brother, then my son, then my wife, and now my nephew. Is nothing to be left me." And for the first and only time in all the years she knew him, before or after, he broke down. And that kind of stuff was in my head when I was writing the scene. And that's the kind of stuff that you would have if you had an American monarchy, because that's what you have with monarchy. I think it was Chesterton who said that whether you like them or not, monarchies or republics, a monarchy is a personal form of government, and a republic is an impersonal form.
Mm-hmm.
And that, now, do I think that anything remotely like what I just depict in the book is ever going to happen? I highly doubt it. I think what's likelier to happen is we'll get a strong man. If we're lucky, Franco. If we're not lucky, Cromwell. But that's what I think we're probably going to get. But I don't know. And it could be through ways that I can't imagine that we would have a real monarchy here. If you wanted a Catholic monarchy, I mean, in the book, he has to deal with the reality that he's Catholic and has to maintain his integrity, but most of his new subjects aren't.
Mm-hmm.
So he makes the sorts of arrangements that Catholic monarchs have made traditionally with the non-Catholic elements of their population. James II, was the head of both the Church of England and the Church of Scotland, even though he was Catholic. The emperors of Austria were heads of the Protestant churches in their country, as were the kings of Bavaria and the kings of Saxony. So, these balancing acts, one of the things is that the governors in my new monarchy are all appointed by the king rather than elected. And the states can create there's no national established church, but every state can have one in accordance with the original Constitution if they want it. So the way I handle this, the very first state to take advantage of this was Utah.
Yep, Mormons.
Mormons. They immediately jump on this. Oh, the other thing is, of course, too, that while the state can establish a church, no member of no citizen of the state can be discriminated against if he doesn't belong to it, which is indeed what we had with the Bill of Rights.
Mm-hmm.
So Utah is the very first state to establish a church, the Mormons, but the first governor the king appoints is a non-Mormon, and no Mormon has ever been appointed a governor of Utah from that day to this. That's your check and balance, you say.
Yeah.
So, and one of the things that was in my mind about that too was that if you go to Salt Lake City, our Cathedral of the Madeleine is incredibly beautiful. And people wonder, well, how did that happen? Well, it happened because every non-Mormon in Salt Lake City donated to it. Every Gentile, didn't matter what they were, Jew, Presbyterian, Jehovah's Witness.
We need something different.
Yeah, something as a counterbalance to the temple. So the Cathedral of the Madeleine is literally you want an ecumenical creation. I mean, it's as Catholic as it gets in terms of its actual appearance and everything else. But almost every Gentile with a dime to spare contributed to it.
Man, I've been to Salt Lake City. I didn't get to see the cathedral, but maybe next time I go. But
it's worth seeing. It's beautiful.
Definitely. I need to go out west more. But Mr. Charles Coulombe, we are at 3 hours.
Yeah.
I am, like I said, this has been a most exhaustive, not in a bad way, but like exhaustive in terms of like a holistic view on, I mean, American history, greater Western history, 20th century history, and our current time. I'm going to have a hell of a time finding a good name for this episode, but no matter what,
you can always steal one from the dear departed past.
That's true.
There was a series. Do you know who James Thurber was?
Sounds familiar.
American writer and cartoonist, 20th century. I think he died in the 50s, before my time. Anyway, they did a show which you can see online. It was very, very funny. The late lamented William Wyndham played, John Monroe, who's really James Thurber, as a cartoonist and a writer for the Manhattanite. In real life, Thurber worked for the New Yorker.
Yep.
But the name of the show is My World and Welcome to It. And it's very funny. So if you want one, you've gotten one way or the other, you've gotten about 3/4 of my worldview out of me. So My World and Welcome to It. All yours, kids, because I'm getting out of here.
Well, I will say, if more people, if any viewer wants to see more of Charles's world, you're more than welcome to follow him on Pelican and any of his other social medias. He maintains a very active presence on Instagram, which is where we first crossed paths, thanks be to God. And I just like to thank everyone that watched this. And once again, Mr. Coulombe, this has been an amazing evening and one of the greatest conversations I think I've ever had in my life. And I guess I'm very blessed that it's recorded. But please get a good night's sleep after this. I know it's very late over there in Austria. And I am just so grateful for you to come on the show. And I hope other people are going to really enjoy this, because I sure as heck did. So thank you so much.
Glad to hear it. You're very welcome. God bless you all. And God bless the United States of America.
There we go. And on that note, good night, everybody.
Good night.